Life in the huge palace had not been quiet for a long time, so from early morning, the maids tried to calm the young lady, who was crying and screaming furiously that she was in great pain. It was clear from the girl's behavior that she could easily harm herself, so the palace residents could not leave her alone for a minute and called the master for help. The lady named Ariadelina did not stop crying bitterly and asked Carlotian, who was holding her hands tightly, to just listen to her words. His eyes at that moment seemed painfully familiar to her, the eyes of someone who was suffering just like her, and it was quite possible that the terrible curse had already been passed on. Carlotian asked all the servants to immediately leave the bedroom of the mansion, and he himself was forced to stay with the crying lady. He understood perfectly well that if things continued like this, Ariadelina might die soon, and right now, he immediately needed to do everything possible to help this girl stay alive. Carlotian took a small carved bottle from his jacket pocket, took a sip from it, and passionately kissed the heroine. He had to do this to make the girl trust him again and open her heart. Ariadelina buried her face, which was still dripping with bitter tears, into the young man's chest. She began to beat her fists into his chest, claiming that it was Carlothian who allowed himself to make her so unhappy because all this time she sincerely trusted him. But now, looking into his cruel eyes, she only dreamed that he would kill her as soon as possible, leaving no chance for a further life together. One day, in the house where a happy family lived, a terrible fire broke out, which took the lives of 2 people. The cause of their death was carbon monoxide poisoning, and the source of the tragic fire was an ordinary cigarette butt. The heroine of the novel grew up in a poor family and dreamed of becoming a singer all her life, so she went to an audition without telling her mother, but in the end she was not accepted. At the funeral ceremony, a young man approached the girl and called her by name. He introduced himself as an employee of a well-known company and asked to accept his condolences on the loss of loved ones. This young man was the president of the company where the girl was auditioning, and strangely enough, this stranger understood that it was very difficult for her now and asked her not to give up. To the girl's great surprise, the young man said important words about her not giving up on the dream she had spoken about at the audition. And by the way, this unexpected opportunity arose as a gift of fate. The singer's life was hard, but all her life she was incredibly happy until that very day came. Trying to cope with her busy schedule, the main character got into an accident, after which the doctor said that it would be very difficult for the girl to sing in the future due to a torn ligament. After the shocking news, Yuna could not believe that everything that happened to her turned out to be the terrible truth, and now she would never be able to be a singer and do what she loved. That day, she lost the only thing that mattered in her life, and that same evening she finally decided to commit suicide, thinking that this was truly the end. Suddenly, the heroine woke up and heard her name, Ariadelina, and probably after the suicide she ended up in a completely different life. The heroine did not understand what was happening to her or where she was, but she still managed to wake up. She woke up in a modest room, lying on a bed, and next to her sat a stranger who was saying something about the crown prince's wedding, which had taken place only yesterday. He also mentioned some strange tragic event that happened just yesterday evening at the gala wedding. The wedding of the crown prince and Princess Dorothée was the main event of the city, which was awaited by all the people of the empire, and hearing the names of the prince and princess, the heroine realized that these were exactly the names from the novel she had recently read. Moreover, this stranger called her by the name Ariadelina, and it was this girl who was a minor character in the novel who was in love with Carlotian. The girl was his fictitious bride, and one day she entered into a false marriage with the young master. Ariadelina loved the young man with all her heart, but he never reciprocated her feelings, and driven mad with jealousy, the girl eventually turned to black magic, and later it became known that she had cast a curse on the princess herself. After this, she was stripped of her noble title and imprisoned in a monastery, and such was her unhappy end. The stranger said that due to a neck injury the girl could not speak, and doctors tried their best to help her while she was unconscious. But for some reason the girl did not recover, and it must have been because of this that she hanged herself. Anyway, I asked the heroine to remain silent for a while, because the injury turned out to be really serious, and again the heroine could not speak, and was haunted by the same problem. Luckily, she still had some of Ariadelina's memories, and she clearly remembered that there was another rope under the bed. The heroine had not enjoyed these migrations and rebirths for a long time, so she was ready to say goodbye to her life again. And now that she had been reborn as the heroine of the novel, she couldn't even speak, and when she woke up, she was incredibly disappointed. But she believed that if the Almighty wanted her to live, and if He really wanted to give her a new life, this time she had the opportunity to change everything. But no matter how much she tried to commit suicide, she was reborn again in Ariadne's body. All this was incredibly strange, but each time the heroine, opening her eyes again, found herself in the same novel, the main character of which was Duke Carlosian. The cause of many of Ariadne's misfortunes was one incident that happened to her in a past life. The pink-haired lady was confident that she was merciful enough to keep the supporting characters alive. But Ariadne, being a girl with a trusting soul, did not even suspect that the princess herself dared to set her up, knowing that the girl trusted her more than anyone else. The princess insisted that all this happened because Ariadne did not know her place and tried to take possession of what did not rightfully belong to her. So she was sure that Carlothian was supposed to be her man, and she finally took her place, while Ariadne was just a convenient pawn. The princess knew that the heroine trusted her, without even realizing that she had been acting on her orders all this time, because no one in their right mind would trust someone who showed a little kindness. Ariadne cried and screamed that Carlosian would never love the princess anyway, but she was incredibly confident in herself and considered Ariana just a stupid girl. That day, Ariadne's life turned upside down because she finally learned the whole cruel truth about the princess's attitude towards her. At that time, Carlosian did not yet know, that behind his back there was a fierce struggle going on the part of the princess to win his heart. That day, the princess treated Ariana cruelly, just when the girl least expected it. The princess admitted in a haughty voice that Ariadne would certainly live a long life, at least until the news of her wedding with the master reaches this backwater, and one day Ariadne learns this news. The cruel reality broke the young girl's heart into tiny pieces, and a sharp pain penetrated every cell of her body, leaving behind incredible mental pain. At that moment, she only wished that she had never known Carlosian without the possibility of ever loving him again. These were the memories of the deceased heroine of the novel, Ariadne, which were preserved in the memory of the reborn heroine. She knew it. This time she failed to die again, and when she went to the mirror and saw her reflection, she realized that the last villain of the novel was that very princess. It was surprising, but the heroine didn't care at all how miserable the heroine's life was before her death. After all, that heroine remained in the past, and in her place came a new Ariadne, who seemed to want to fix everything. But there was one problem, and every time after reincarnation, everything repeated itself again and again, and this happened many times already. Since the girl first hanged herself and was reborn, she had taken her own life dozens or even hundreds of times. And if she is constantly reborn, then the girl's wounds should heal, but not only the scar on her neck but also the scars on her hands were still fresh. There were also painful wounds on her body from a knife stab to the stomach and chest, but the story had long since ended and the heroine still could not die. She thought there was no reason to continue playing her role after the story ended, and this time she was determined to try to change places. And perhaps the sacred power of the nearby monastery prevented her from committing suicide all this time. Ariadne, holding the rope tightly in her hands, had already tried to do this many times and had even learned to find a suitable tree to conveniently secure the gallows. This time she was sure that she had finally found a huge place where no one would disturb her, but the next second she heard someone's footsteps nearby. The young man with ringing eyes saw the girl, and it turned out that he had been looking for her for a long time. The young man called the girl by name and probably wanted to find out why she was here alone with a rope in her hands. Ariadne was sure that no one should have been here at this time, and the appearance of this young man was rather strange. The stranger tried to snatch the rope from the girl's hands, shouting that she was about to do something incredible and that she should think twice. The lady felt severe pain in her wrists after the young man grabbed both of her hands, trying to keep her close to him. He asked what the girl was going to do with this rope, and whether she was planning to run away again. The stranger continued to hold her by her bloody wrists, carefully examining the bruises that covered the girl's entire body. For Ariadne, nothing mattered now, so she snatched the rope from the young men and declared that she had important things to do and he should not disturb her. Ariadalena knew that if she walked a little forward, she would find that very suitable tree in the distance. She would have absolutely no time to hesitate so as not to fall through again. She began to run barefoot through the thick green grass, while the young man continued to try to stop her. He was perplexed, because the girl immediately began to offend as soon as the comedy noticed someone in the distance, and it was completely unclear what was happening here. Suddenly, Prince Luciano and Princess Dorothea, who were just walking through the garden, approached him. The young man said that he had just found Ariadalena in the forest, and she was trying to cause trouble for everyone again, so she should be caught immediately. Luciano insisted that it was too dangerous for the lady, so she needed to stay here, and he and Benjamin would go in search of Ariadalena. Dorothy insisted that she would go with the boys, because if the girl was going to use dark magic, she had better be there and participate in everything that was happening. Luciano thanked the lady for her help and decided to give the order to start the search. All this time, sitting with a sea rope on a tree, Ariadalena tried to understand whether the soul of the real heroine was cursing her in this way because she died. She was sorry, but she couldn't allow it to happen again, because every moment of such a life was unbearable for her. The heroine tied a rope around her neck and tried to jump from the tree to finally put an end to the fact that she was used to express feelings. She was ready to die at any second, but for some reason she felt a strange sensation on her neck and opened her frightened eyes. As soon as Ariadalena opened her eyes, everything immediately became clear to her because the young man was holding her legs tightly, preventing the noose from strangling the girl's neck. The noose hung loosely around Rihanna's neck, and after all the suicide attempts, she was already incredibly tired of hearing the same phrase. This time she was saved by Benjamin, the Crown Prince's guard, and as far as the heroine remembered, he was a minor character who was unrequitedly in love with Dorothy. The girl was pretty fed up with all the events that were getting in the way, and she just wanted to die peacefully so that no one would bother her and not to commit a demonstrative suicide in front of the main characters. And no matter how much she didn't want it, the main characters just at that moment ran up to her and saw that she was trying to hang herself from a tree. The young man cut the rope with his sword, and Dorothea excitedly asked if Ariadalena had just tried to take her own life. Dorothy, experiencing strong, excited feelings, could not find a place for herself from what she saw. But she was even more shocked by Ariadalena's appearance, because the girl's entire body was covered in terrible scars. It was indeed quite creepy, and Ariadalena smirked that the princess's reaction was exactly like that of a saint. Even though the heroine Ariadalena had been trying to curse her entire life, this sweet girl still worried about her in any situation. But she just wanted Dorothy not to get into her soul anymore, because it hadn't concerned her for a long time. Dorothy tried to find out what had happened to the girl, but the lady remained silent and flatly refused to talk. Finally, the princess realized that Ariadalena had lost her voice and could not speak, so she promised to heal her throat. In this novel, Dorothea was a saint, and she definitely had healing abilities stronger than any monk, and if it was an external wound, then she was able to heal it. If Dorothea can heal Ariadalena's voice again, she will be able to sing again and return to her former happy life, and then she will no longer have to try to die. As in the original novel, the saint who renounced her position, Dorothea was a saint with a great gift of healing. And now Ariadalena only had to trust this girl and find out how the mysterious healing happens. Suddenly, the princess crossed her arms over her chest and began to sing in a soft, thin voice, and this melody spread to the farthest corners of the forest. Her voice was beautiful and enchanting, and Dorothea could heal with her magical song, and as soon as Ariadalena heard the magical sounds of the voice, something began to happen in her throat. Dorothy stopped and was frightened when she saw that Ariadalena was writhing in unbearable pain holding her throat. She screamed that her throat was incredibly burning and that she was experiencing hellish pain, so Dorothy should stop singing. The young man asked Mrs. Dorothy to move away, but the lady did not understand why the wound, which should heal, was not healing, but on the contrary, was causing severe pain. Dorothy was sure that her healing singing always helped, and this time there could be no mistake. Ariadalena continued to wheeze, feeling unbearable pain in her throat, neck, and throughout her body, which spread in waves through every cell. The heroine immediately realized that this wound could not be healed, and now she would have to accept the fact that she would never be able to speak again. She began to hit the boy with her fists and scream at the people to let her die and just leave her alone, to die the way she wanted. An honorary assembly was held at the Cathedral of St. Berail, where brothers and sisters gathered to pray together. Dorothea decided to take the girl to pray to the holy gods, and was probably upset because she was still crying loudly. Ariadalina couldn't concentrate at all in the prayer hall, and she didn't want to read anything, because the novel was over, and she just wanted to die alone. The stained glass window of the cathedral's huge window depicted the sacred Borel, to whom Ariadalina had one last request. She looked into his eyes and wished that he would hear her plea, because she was pretty tired of fighting. When Ariadalina opened the Bible, she was surprised, because the words in the Bible moved by themselves, and there was something written in it about a heroine who failed to take her own life. The girl carefully read every word, and with each second she understood more and more that this was a branch of the novel's plot. In the scene with Carlosian, something strange happened that the heroine did not know about before, but she returned to kill him. In the novel, Ariadalina wanted to make sure that Carlosian would never be able to forget her, even when this woman was gone, but the Duke was not the kind of person who cared about such trifles. In the novel, Carlosian continued to make his wife unhappy until her death, and in the heroine's opinion, this ending was too cruel, because Ariadalina was filled with unchanging pure love for the young master. And it is unclear what the point is then in going so far in the plot of the novel, because this is far from the most important thing. But Ariadalina was sure that if everything went according to the plot, perhaps she could die from the Duke's sword. As soon as the incredible thought came into the girl's head, she immediately left the prayer hall right during the service. The priest assured her that the service was not over yet, and that the lady should wait a while until it was over. For some reason, after hearing these words, the heroine could not remember Ariadalina's line, which was definitely in this branch. The young man was outraged that Ariadalina always did everything her own way, and only created serious problems for the people around her. But if Ariadalina definitely had a line at that moment, then why was I, the reincarnated heroine, left without a voice and now can't pronounce it? It's very strange, but Ariadalina from the branch can speak, but the current heroine does not have such an opportunity. The most opportune moment, the prince and princess appeared, who looked indignantly at the young man who was speaking rudely to Ariadalina. He did not expect to see honorable guests here, and at that moment a tearful Ariadalina stood next to him. Dorothy tried to find out why the girl was crying again, and something must have happened to her since she had not been able to pull herself together for a long time. Ariadalina felt that she could not hope for a happy life and the attention of kind and caring people who would give it to her in the future anyway. Therefore, the only way out with a happy ending could only be Ariadalina's death, and the question of whether she could die did not leave her for a second. But if everything that happened was really true, Ariadalina just wanted someone to understand her pain and just help her say goodbye to life. She wanted to close it off, for everyone to hear that she just wanted to die and never fight again. After Ariadalina's strange behavior, Dorothée often sat in her office and thought that the scar on the girl's neck did not look as if it had appeared from one suicide attempt, and she probably could have tried to hang herself several times, and that thought sounds even more terrible. Luciano asked the princess what she was thinking about, since her face expressed extreme anxiety. He came because he was afraid that she would lose her temper after the announcement of the Duke's engagement, but she turned out to be calmer than he expected. Everyone understood perfectly well that this news could drive an innocent girl crazy, but still, they had to announce the marriage soon in a monastery outside the capital, and it would not be good for the newlyweds to remain in such a place. Dorothée was sure they couldn't do it, but Luciano didn't understand what she meant. But she knew for sure that Ariadalina needed to be sent to the capital urgently soon. Standing surrounded by these people, Ariadalina was in a state of complete senselessness, not quite understanding what the hell was going on around her. Dorothy and the prince clearly wanted something from her, so they showed persistent concern for her. They were so persistent that Ariadalina even let them into her bedroom to finally figure out what they really wanted from her. The princess smiled and promised to leave as soon as she tried to heal Ariana again. Ariadalina was already pretty tired of the princess constantly hanging around her and trying to force her to do something. She was irritated by everything that was happening around her now, and especially by Dorothée, who for the first time failed to heal her voice. And so she was completely sure that all efforts were pointless and the princess needed to finish quickly and just leave. After some time, Dorothy became convinced that the healing did not work on the heroine, and she thanked her for her patience. The princess was about to leave, but for some reason she was not going to take with her the young man with whom she had come. Luciano wondered if Ariadolina was trying to attract the princess's attention, and if she was doing all this because she really wanted to return to the capital. Ariadolina didn't believe his words when she heard that they were really going to take her to the capital together. Ariadolina was silent for a while, and Luciano found her expression incredibly stupid. Dorothy said that she would personally take the lady to the capital's temple and would monitor everything that would happen there. She insisted that the priest had not taken proper care of Ariadolina, as he had not even known about her wounds and the huge bruises that had clearly appeared recently. The priest tried to find the words to explain his position and why the girl's body was so traumatized. He insisted that she did it all on purpose and that it was only her fault, but Dorothy didn't believe his words one bit. Having promised that in any case today, Ariadolina will be under the supervision of the temple, and if she says so, the priest can only follow her order. Luciano also wanted to figure out what the princess was up to and what she was going to do next with this stupid girl. He had a special attitude towards Ariadolina, but on the other hand, he understood perfectly well why sweet Dorothy felt sorry for an unfamiliar woman. But he was sure that she was a criminal, and the princess should not pay so much attention to her circumstances and condition, but the princess knew that Ariadolina was using dark magic on herself. And it was this problem that worried Dorothy, and that is why she tried so desperately to help her. Luciano sensed from the very beginning that something was wrong, and was sure that they had to execute this criminal immediately. But Dorothy tried to convince her burden that he was wrong, and the reason dark magic was so scary was not only because it affected the caster. It also corrupts the souls of those it strikes, plunging their souls into deep, dark suffering. When Ariadolina used dark magic before, she was unable to kill Luciano, and if that was the case, her soul should have been spared from suffering. But this means that by consciously using dark magic on herself, the girl desperately wants to go to hell. Luciano doubted it. The lady could not do this, and Princess Dorothea also knows this very well, but it is completely unclear why she has changed so much. This time there was definitely no doubt that something had changed in her, and neither Princess Dorothy nor the prince knew the real reason. Something so terrible must have happened that she wanted to lock her soul in eternal torment, and perhaps she already regrets the past. Luciano finally understood why Dorothy was going to take Ariadolina to the capital, since the believers here would not be able to stop her. She asked Luciano to treat this girl with special respect, and not to forget that instead of helping her, her parents once abandoned her. After listening to her words, Luciano agreed that he would accompany the lady to the capital for their common well-being. With all her efforts, Dorothea made sure that Ariadolina went to the capital accompanied by loyal knights. It was on the princess's initiative that it was decided that Ariadolina would go to the capital, but in fact she had been looking for a way to leave for a long time and finally found it. But she certainly doubted that anyone in the capital would be happy about her sudden appearance. The heroine Ariadolina was a real villain and constantly tormented Dorothea, so she was notorious even among the common people. If they had arrived during the day, Ariadolina was sure she would have been pelted with stones, but in the end, everything turned out as it should. With a movement of her hand, Ariadolina showed the passing young man that she urgently needed one sheet of paper. The young man gave her one white sheet of paper and a pen, and that should have been enough for the lady. Finally, they arrived at the appointed place in the capital temple, which looked incredibly majestic with ancient architecture and graceful statues. The escort untied the prisoner's ropes on her hands, and finally, from that moment, she could be free again. All this time, she was incredibly waiting for this moment, when the shackles would be removed from her hands, and she would again feel the smell of freedom. As soon as the rope fell to the ground, Ariadolina immediately rushed forward, because she had nothing more to lose in this life, and also nothing to be afraid of. If everything is as it was in the side stories, Carlothian will approach the temple lake to think about Dorothea at that very moment. She needed to be in front of Carlothian at that second, and just a couple of minutes later, she saw the silhouette of the venerable gentleman in the distance. The young man looked with surprised eyes at the breathless stranger who was running straight towards him. Ariadalina had no intention of remaining unnoticed, so she immediately approached the young master and greeted him. On this ordinary day, fate brought these two young people together, but the young man was here for a completely different reason. He asked in a velvety voice why he saw this stranger in front of him, who definitely shouldn't be here. The lady handed the young gentleman a piece of paper with only 2 words written on it, and she was asking him right then and there to kill her. Ariadalina no longer knew who to turn to, and Carlothian was her last, only hope. The young man remained silent. Ariadalina managed to think, she already looked so terrible, but this man should not care. He asked why the girl was in the capital, but he did not know that she had appeared here with his saint. He asked if Ariadalina had come here to harm Princess Dorothea again, but the heroine knew that this was not the case. Grabbing the hilt of his sword, Carlothian screamed that he was truly fed up with all of this, and Ariadalina agreed with him more than ever at that moment, and asked him to just end it. The knights who had been chasing the girl all this time had finally found her and were now right behind her. But seeing the girl in the distance, they did not even try to stop Carlothian, and it seemed that everyone wanted the death of poor innocent Ariadalina. In the end, her fate was bound to end tragically anyway, and that evening she was destined to die from the island of the venerable gentleman's ball. Surely no one ever loved the girl, and all this was solely her fault. Just like the heroine who lost her voice, she was also not loved by anyone. Lying on the cold, wet grass, exhausted and wounded by the sword, Ariadalina just wanted it all to end quickly. Carlothian stood over the girl's body, and her face was illuminated by the dim moonlight, reflecting the reflections of the ball, sparkling even in the semi-darkness. Before leaving, Ariadalina wanted to say something to the young master so that not a drop of worry would remain in her soul. She slowly began to feel sleepy, and her eyes began to gradually close, but suddenly she heard the thin and delicate voice of Dorothea. Opening her eyes, she saw a young princess in front of her, but she did not understand at all what was happening now, because a second ago she was standing next to the Duke. Something incredible was happening, but Ariadalina was still alive, and she was definitely not in the temple. Dorothea remembered that the girl was left without a voice and could not answer at all, so she quickly handed over a notebook and a pen so that the lady could tell what had happened. The girl wrote on a piece of paper whether it was true that Dorothea saved her, since her past life ended tragically. Dorothea said she was very surprised at the moment when the young master pointed the sword at her, and this act was very terrible on the part of Carlothian. She admitted that she could not let the girl die at that moment, so she used her magical abilities to bring her lifeless body back to life. Ariadalina didn't understand whether Dorothea really thought that these knights couldn't stop Carlothian when he deliberately pulled out his sword. At first, Dorothea did not understand what her friend wanted to say, but soon she began to guess what was happening. In fact, all the people around wanted Ariadalina to die. Everyone except the princess wanted Ariadalina to die soon. And she was sure that Dorothea should hate her too, because she deserved it, and therefore should never interfere in her life or control her actions again. Dorothea showed up. The lady was probably very tired, so she asked the heroine to rest a little because fatigue had a detrimental effect on her health. Left alone in the bedroom, Ariadalina, who was absolutely disappointed in everything, did not understand what else she could do because the last chances seemed to have been missed. There is also a side story, and something probably happened there that caused her to still be alive. Some time after the princess left, the door to the girl's bedroom opened again, and before her eyes, a tall, stately young man appeared. He asked if the girl was awake, and it seemed that he was not the only one worried about Ariadalina's condition. She sincerely did not understand why the Duke was hanging around here, but the young man admitted that he was very sorry and he did not know that Dorothea had brought her here. The lady assumed that Dorothea must have told the young gentleman something that prompted him to visit her in her bedroom. After he cut her with his sword, did he really think that a simple sorry would be enough? But in this endlessly repeating life, the heroine was no longer against it, because Carlothian was the only one who could save her, and also the only one who could kill her. Ariadalina quietly admitted that if the young man was truly sorry, he could fulfill her last request and kill her right now. After all, he probably doesn't care about the existence of one unknown girl who has absolutely no meaning for him. Ariadalina grabbed the young man by the hands and stretched his palms to her throat, asking him to quickly end her torment and never doubt his actions. Carlothian pulled his hands back because the girl's behavior looked to him like the behavior of a real madwoman. Ariadalina's gaze was directed into emptiness, and her eyes reflected longing, as if she was looking for a way out, but could not find it. She dreamed only of leaving everything behind and finding the one who was inaccessible to her after each death, and her only desire was to get rid of the pain that tightly squeezed her soul. It may not have been the right way to go after everything that had happened, but Ariadalina had no other choice. The girl's behavior caused the Duke concern, because it seemed that she was becoming more and more uncontrollable with each passing day. A few hours ago, an event occurred that influenced the further change in the plot of the novel. The princess brought Ariadalina here on purpose, assuring him that the healing magic had worked this time, but Carlothian couldn't believe her words. The girl insisted that Ariadalina was no longer what she used to be, but it all sounded rather unrealistic. Dorothy asked to take Ariana to her room because she was supposed to wake up in a while. Ariana in a black robe, stained with scarlet blood, in his arms and with a young man in her bedroom. The Duke wondered if there really were wounds that even Dorothy's magic couldn't heal, and they had never encountered anything like that before. Carlothian promised the princess that as soon as Lady Ariadalina woke up, he would definitely go to her room to apologize to her for what he had just killed. And then he will be able to ask about the true purpose of the meeting with her, which Ariadalina was so eager to have. Dorofeev asked only to fulfill one of her requests, to promise that this apology would be sincere and come from a pure heart. Carlothian promised the princess that he would do everything exactly like this, but he learned that this was another of her evil plans. He immediately noticed the countless marks around her neck, as if she had tried to hang herself, and the fresh wounds on her body. Ariadalina's expression that evening was quite frightening, as if she had truly gone mad and was ready to say goodbye to life once and for all. These thoughts did not give the young master any peace, because Ariadalina clearly had something in mind this time when she tearfully begged him to take her life and not to doubt. The girl's expression flashed before his eyes as she grabbed his hands and tried to strangle herself with his own hands. It was an expression he had never seen before, and words he had never heard from her before. Therefore, one could say for sure that Ariadalina's behavior was so crazy that the girl had definitely gone crazy. After this conversation, she was taken to the main priest himself, who from the very first minutes declared that he clearly felt the presence of otherworldly forces. He shouted, an aura of dark magic emanating from this evil woman, pointing at the frightened Ariadalina. This old man seemed very influential to the girl, and after his words, Dorofei declared that Ariadalina should under no circumstances use dark magic on others. The priest understood the princess's generosity, but assured them that they should not allow the villain to deceive them again, because no one believed that Ariadalina sincerely regretted her past mistakes. Dorofei insisted that the aura of dark magic emanated from Lyri, which is why it was necessary to find out the reason. But whatever it was, we could not allow that dark magic remained uncontrolled. The princess listened attentively to the words of the great high priest, and at that moment, Ariadalina realized that this old man was the great priest, who continued to insist that there was no other option but the death penalty, since dark forces cannot be tamed. Hearing this, Ariadalina finally became genuinely happy because death was great for her, and the end of the Villainess would only be her death. Carlothian would probably have to kill her, but Ariadalina couldn't just rush in there. Since Ariadalina could not say anything with her voice, she asked those present to give her a pen and 3 blank sheets of paper. This woman turned out to be ready to do anything to finally achieve her goal and die peacefully. She carefully wrote some words on pieces of paper and presented them to the high priest. Ariadalina called herself a person who deserved to die, but she had only one last wish. She wished to look better, but learned that she could not look good. But at least she had to look as evil as possible. A devilish spark appeared in the girl's eyes, and it seemed like the game was going according to her rules. She wrote on the pieces of paper that she would like to be beheaded by her beloved ex-husband, and that only such a death would suit her. The young man did not expect to be drawn into matters with this girl again, and sincerely tried to stay away from her. Hearing such an unexpected proposal, the priest looked at the princess, as if waiting for what she would say next. Ariadalina didn't quite understand, but she thought that everything was going well. I really hoped for my victory. After all, Carlothian was her ex-husband, and was the only one who could kill her. Suddenly, Ariadalina, who was sitting on her knees on the floor, grabbed her throat and began to breathe heavily and with difficulty, making strange wheezing sounds. She felt that her throat was hurting very badly, as if hundreds of sharp knives were stabbing her neck. But she knew one thing, that recently she could not make a single sound and could not even express her hellish pain in words. But Ariadalina understood that now was not the time for this, and she absolutely needed to finish what she had started. There was genuine pleading in Ariadalina's eyes, and she really hoped that Dorothy would not interfere with her choice. The priest, who was obediently waiting for the girl's conversation to end, finally made an important decision. Dorothy grabbed the lady by the hands, and this time she was interested in only one question: why had she recently burst into tears? She asked the high priest to look at Ariadalina's expressive face, because she should be given a chance to repent and avoid tragic involvement. But it turned out that Ariadalina did not need any repentance, but considered this option an excellent chance to, however, say goodbye to life, until the high priest asked to give him a little time to think about it. He noticed that the princess had never been so merciful, and there was certainly something special about this girl. The previous Ariadalina, as the Duke's youngest daughter, would never have bowed her head, even when Carlochian, her fictitious husband, treated her coldly. Dorothy didn't know all the details, but she was sure of one thing: this woman didn't deserve to die, because she didn't flinch, no matter how badly they treated her. She said that the girl's body had numerous bruises and abrasions, and that she had also tried to commit suicide several times. And what's more, the strangest thing is that she asked her ex-husband to have a hand in her tragic death. They told the high priest that Ariadalina had personally asked Karl Dion to be the one to execute her with his sword. And just recently, she personally confessed to the young gentleman that she only wanted to die at his hands and from his ball. There is no way this woman would know nothing about the Honorable Lord's sword. It was known to all that this sword was given by the Emperor himself, and it was one of the two legendary swords associated with the myth of the creation of the Empire. This sword of the Crown Prince symbolized light and purification. But there was the dark sword of Duke Carlochian, which symbolized darkness and punishment. Rumors have arisen that those killed by this world go to hell, but there are also opinions that the owner of the sword suffers from mental disorders for the rest of their days. If Ariadalina really did use dark magic, it was no wonder she could easily believe such nonsense. The priest also expressed his opinion that Ariadalina constantly cast dark magic on herself and tried to commit suicide more than once. And now she decided to use the magic sword of Duke Carlochian to finally get to hell. Dorothea assured the high priest that many say and deserve death, but only a few actually follow this statement. But Lady Ariadalina has long changed, and this time everyone needs to give this girl one last chance to cope. Born and raised in the temple, she had such a pure and tender heart, and the high priest was afraid that the girl might suffer because she occupied such a high position. He promised to take care of the sinful girl, and the princess should return back, because the crown prince had been waiting for her for a long time. Dorothea was grateful that the high priest had taken the time to listen to her carefully and followed her advice. After all this, the Duke personally approached the high priest and was going to ask him for one request. Assuring that Ariadalina was certainly up to something, he asked for his permission to observe the strange girl. The priest said he would discuss the matter later, but Carlochian insisted that there was no point in wasting time when it was just keeping an eye on the criminal. The priest understood that the young master had no respect for the woman who had once been his wife. From that very day, the high priest decided to introduce the girl to a young priest who would have to take care of her from that day on. But the heroine absolutely did not want anyone to look after her or even follow her. Also, Ariadalina will have to live in the temple, but she just wished that instead of them leaving her here, they would rather send her to the common cemetery at the temple. The priest stroked the girl's face and asked her never to think about such things again. From that day on, Ariadalina's life changed, and she was introduced to the overseer Dranks, who was supposed to report everything to the priest if anything happened to the girl. It had been only a short time since Ariadalina had appeared in the temple, but now it seemed to her that her life was getting worse and worse. Only a few days had passed since the young priest had been appointed as warden, and he had already dared to raise his hand against a defenseless lady. He was sure that the villainess had constantly tormented Mrs. Dorothy, and even dared to come here after everything she had done. The high priest must have been busy all this time, and he never came to visit Ariadalina, and this overseer was constantly nearby and humiliating the girl. He had mocked her, and to be honest, even now Ariadalina did not understand why she had come to the capital at all, to experience new torments. In any case, she was sure that she needed to be patient for a little while, because recently the warden had begun to kill her less often, and if his interest waned, she would have a chance to escape. The young man tried to reason with the girl so that she would finally understand her situation and would not dare to run away and complain to anyone about everything that was happening. He ordered her to behave decently and not cause any problems, and in that case everything would be fine with her. The young man threw a piece of stale bread at the girl, and it seemed that this was all the food that was intended, and it was fortunate that the high priest did not know about it, because if he found out about the violence, he could appoint even more guards. But seeing the bruises on her body, Ariadalina thought about it and decided that she definitely had to escape from here, and after a few days, she succeeded in something. Being in confinement turned out to be incredibly boring, and this is probably why prisoners do not like solitary confinement. Drance has been appearing quite rarely lately, and perhaps the heroine has come to the perfect time to plan an escape. One ordinary day, the warden finally showed up in Ariadalina's room, and she was very surprised. Without saying anything, he slowly walked into the room and again grabbed the girl by the hair, as he had done before. He muttered something about high rank and old men who thought they could talk down to him and look down on the young priest. Ariadalina understood that this villain was going to take out all his anger on her right now, just because the other priests laughed at him. He insisted that Ariadalina was to blame for everything and that everyone hated her, because the servants only made fun of him because he was stuck, caring about someone like her. And he was sure that people like Ariadalina should die and not ruin the lives of other people with their appearance. And at that moment, grabbing the legs of the chair, Ariadalina decided that right now she had to escape and nothing else could stop her. She hit the fighter on the head with the stool with all her might, trying to apply as much force as possible to land the blow. The lady managed to escape once again, and Drance, who had been mocking her all this time, now only saw her running silhouette. Ariadalina could no longer bear everything that was happening and had to go to the high priest to tell the whole truth. The girl deftly jumped out of the window and ran barefoot along the snow-white pavement towards the temple. But the warden continued to run after her, and soon she heard his voice behind her, menacingly asking her to stop. The heroine knew she needed to run faster, but as soon as she thought about it, she tripped and fell right onto the concrete road. She had to hurry. But the young man still caught up with her, grabbed her hand and shouted that Ariadalina was a complete non-entity and she would never be able to escape. The girl looked at the warden, waiting to see what he was going to do next, because he couldn't kill her in front of everyone near the temple. The young man even managed to swing his fist towards the girl's head, declaring that she was destined to die right there. But his opinion was proven wrong when in the distance he saw the approaching figure of the Duke, who had seen with his own eyes what the warden was trying to do in the great temple. For Ariadalina, Carlothian has now become a real savior, because if he had not appeared, everything would have been very bad. Of course, she did not expect to see him here, but the appearance of the young gentleman gave her hope for salvation. The Duke approached the warden and asked him again what he had just been about to do when he had raised his fist at the young lady. The young man claimed that he was simply punishing the naughty girl because she had thrown a chair at him and tried to escape. But it all looked as if the priest had raised his hand against someone inside the holy temple, and that was why the surrender happened. The Duke reminded the young man that the high priest had recently said that he needed to take care of the hostage, but under no circumstances should he cause her serious harm. The young man had nothing to say in response because everyone understood perfectly well that he had been committing terrible acts all this time. And there is no justification for these actions because the warden was guided only by his own choice when he abused the young girl. Carlothian took out his sword to show the boy what he deserved for his actions, but suddenly the girl blocked his way. He didn't understand why this girl rushed to protect the man who was just about to kill her. She put her throat under the point of the sword, spread her arms out to the side, and seemed to be waiting for the Duke to kill her with his own hands. Ariadalina hoped that the Duke would understand that she had no need to protect the villain, but simply wanted to die first. The Duke thoughtfully lowered his head and thought that the lady had really gone crazy because she was asking him to kill her for the umpteenth time. The young man laid down his arms and admitted that he did not intend to kill anyone, but that the man would still be punished. It seemed to Ariadolina that the Duke did not understand her at all, but suddenly the young man leaned closer to her and looked closely into her eyes. He looked closely at her face and seemed to see something familiar or painfully close there. The lady sincerely did not understand what had happened to her face, because in the novel Ariadolina was always a charming beauty. But now her face was covered in bruises and abrasions, and her gaze did not express any joy or desire to live. The previous temple had also neglected Ariadolina, and she couldn't blame that particular priest, because in the end, sinners were treated exactly as they deserved. But it turned out that the Duke had a certain punishment for this man, so that he would finally understand how shamefully he was acting. And if they had not been near the sacred temple, he would have cut off the scoundrel's head right then and there. Ariadolina watched closely what was happening and saw how the warden bowed his head before the Duke, and at that moment she felt incredible disgust. She excitedly grabbed the Duke by the hand and forced him to turn around and look into her eyes. Unfortunately, Ariadolina could not say anything, but only show with her emotions what she wanted. And the Duke agreed because nothing could be done, and the punishment could be postponed for some time because Ariadolina was clearly frightened. He promised that it would never happen again, but for some reason the girl still had a strange expression on her face. And he took her by the hand and asked her to go with him so that no one would dare to mock her anymore. She didn't understand where the Duke was leading her because one blow was not enough to kill. In fact, Ariadolina did not want to go anywhere else, but for some reason the Duke took her to the honorary high priest. The girl did not immediately understand that they were heading to the temple to see the high priest again. The priest was surprised to see Duke Carlosian enter, and next to him was Ariadolina, covered in bruises and abrasions. He came closer to examine the girl's face and asked her to urgently tell him what had happened. It was obvious from the girl's face that it was swollen from numerous blows, and Carlosian turned to the high priest, who had previously promised to take care of the Aryan. And the heroine realized that it was at that moment that Carlothian himself defended her honor before the high priest. Ariadolina saw a piece of paper and a pen on the table and did not miss the opportunity to write a note to the high priest. On the small white sheet of paper there was only one question, and Ariadolina wanted to know when her execution would take place. The priest took the girl by the shoulder and declared that this time he was wrong, and the girl would definitely be saved, so she should stop thinking about such things again. All the villains in the novels were always executed, but for some reason everyone slowly tried to defend Ariadolina, and this time the Duke again asked the high priest to take a closer look. And he warned that if Dorothy was worried after learning the whole truth, the high priest would have huge problems. The Duke also ordered the punishment of the priest who had been looking after the girl until then, because all this time he had really dared to mock her. After talking with the high priest, the Duke looked into the girl's eyes until she understood what he wanted from her. But suddenly the young man asked the girl in a gentle voice to come with him in front of everyone present. Rumors had already spread in the temple. Many had heard that Drance had punished a sinner, and something strange had happened between them. Ariadolina didn't want any rumors to start. She was sure everything would be fine as soon as the culprit of these rumors disappeared. She was sure that the Duke was going to kill her somewhere in secret, without telling Dorothy about it, and she thought this was a wonderful idea, because she was ready to die at any time. Ariadolina was delighted, and thought that the young man would do it quickly, and would certainly kill her without much suffering. But as they continued on their way, they saw nearby a priest who was mocking her, and the high priest already knew about his actions. In front of all the clergy, the young man insisted that it was the devilish woman herself who had prompted him to commit cruel acts. And this bad girl deserves death more than ever, because she alone is to blame for many human sins. Ariadolina stopped to listen to the lying speeches of the scoundrel Drance, who tried to shift all the blame onto her. All the words he spoke in front of the priests were brazen lies, which in his opinion should justify him. But every villain always gets what he deserves, and this time Drance was no exception. Carlothian did not try to let the young priest get away with his cruel deeds, so he came closer to him, took out a sharp sword, and ordered the young man to be silent. The priest learned that the Duke could do anything, so he tried his best to stop him. He promised that he would make sure that the criminal was punished, and asked the Duke not to kill him near the sacred temple. Looking at the high priest with a cold gaze, the Duke only asked him to step aside and not get underfoot. But all the words of supplication were in vain, because before the Duke stood a guilty criminal who, right before his eyes, was about to hit an innocent girl and deserved punishment. Ariadilena felt conflicting emotions warring within her. Relief that justice had been restored, and fear of what consequences this might bring. At that moment she realized that even when evil is destroyed, it does not always mean the end of suffering. But the only thing that was real was that right now, before his eyes, the Duke was finally dealing with the warden who had been cruelly torturing her all these days. Ariadilena stood in the center of the hall, her heart pounding in her chest, her gaze fixed on the Duke, who stood before her with a cold expression on his face. It seemed like it was a deep and ugly jealousy, because Ariadilena was the one who really wanted to die, but for some reason, Drance's lifeless body was lying right in front of her. She did not understand why the Duke decided to kill him, and now everything seemed very strange to Ariadilena. She was still in this world, but now she didn't understand what she was doing here at all, and who could help her. The heroine's strength was running out, and she did not understand why everyone was resisting her death, and at the same time unrealistically wanted her to die. The stunned clergy who had seen the Duke kill the young priest stood there, unable to move. The high priest ordered the others to carry away the young man's body before anyone else saw it. But one young man who saw all this could not understand at all why this girl was crying for the one who wanted her dead. After some time, Ariadilena was sitting in a luxurious, comfortable carriage, and opposite her was the venerable Duke. The heroine wanted to know where the young gentleman was taking her, but during all this time he had not said a word. Suddenly he stood up and asked the girl to get out of the carriage, but it didn't seem like they were stopping. Ariadilena didn't even have time to look out the window, so she had absolutely no idea where they could be. As she stepped out of the carriage, she realized that this view was quite familiar to her, and if she was to believe the memories of the previous heroine, she definitely knew this place. As they exited the carriage, Gorlatian extended his hand to the girl, but she was afraid of it as if it were fire. She had not actually asked the Duke to accompany her, but it was important that they had arrived at this place where the Duke of Carlodian's mansion was located. Soon Ariadilena guessed that they had arrived at the master's home when the butler came out and respectfully greeted the owner. He asked that a room be prepared in the outbuilding for the new guest, and the butler was momentarily surprised by his words. Behind him, he saw an innocent blue-eyed girl with many bruises and abrasions on her face. The butler again saw the young master's ex-wife, who was no longer the mistress of this house, and now he ordered everyone to treat her as a criminal. He also ordered that at least 3 servants be assigned to the girl, and that she not be allowed to move freely, and that any suspicious behavior be reported immediately. Even though Ariadilena stood next to the master, he did not hesitate to openly say that he would watch her every step. The butler asked the lady to go into one of the rooms, listening carefully to all the instructions of his master. The Duke ordered all his courtiers to treat his ex-wife as his criminal, but the butler was clearly a kind man and still called her a lady. The Duke couldn't stop thinking about the fact that this girl was trying to protect the man who had harmed her and tried to hurt her. The same thing happened at another moment, and Ariadilena tried again and again to make the Duke kill her with his own hands. If Carlothian had clearly wanted it, he would have committed the crime long ago, but he in no way wanted to harm his ex-wife. But the most incredible thing was that Ariadilena even cried because of the Duke, and he had never seen her behave like that before. He caught himself thinking that for a long time now he couldn't stop thinking about Ariadilena's behavior, and as if he was looking for at least a drop of justification in her actions. He knew that in the past this woman had tried to kill the Dorofeeves and even used strong black magic. And while Dorofei believed Ariadilena, the Duke was sure that the girl was plotting something and was not telling the whole truth. Suddenly, the Duke heard a voice in his head from the girl, convincing his house that he was constantly looking at Ariana as if he cared. The voice claimed that it was his fault that the innocent girl had gone down the path of evil, and Carlothian was subject to strange thoughts. He realized that he might soon have another painful attack, so he asked the butler where the medicine was. The Duke was already beginning to be tormented by physical pain, but he still could not stop thinking that even that woman had not always been like this. In his head, he heard strange voices that claimed that Ariadilena was not guilty of anything, and it was the Duke who brought the girl to such a terrible state. The voice stated that Ariadilena was simply a nuisance, and that the Duke needed to kill her so that no more problems would arise. He screamed for the evil voice in his head to stop telling him that this girl needed to be strangled and her suffering ended. At this time, the butler politely showed the lady the room and asked if she really felt comfortable in such a place. The butler knew that the lady had difficulty speaking, so he prepared a pen and notepad for her in advance. She didn't expect that anyone in this estate would take care of her or treat her even minimally well. Ariana asked the butler to bring a knife and an empty bottle, and that was her only small request. She smiled sweetly and said there was something she wanted to put inside, and it was her little secret. There were always ominous rumors surrounding the venerable Duke, because every inhabitant of the empire knew this man. He was considered a murderer and a maniac, and rumors about his sword spread everywhere, and some even say that the Duke himself suffers from mental illness. The only person who accepted him was Princess Dorothea, who was sure that the Duke was appearing before her as he really was. Dorothea didn't care about the dirty rumors, because she knew this man personally and was confident in his actions. Surely the Duke will never be able to forget Dorothea, even if she becomes the lover of another man in the future. But no matter how often their love story, Ariadolina followed her rules and tried to take something further. She held the glass flask with the scarlet liquid in her hands and wondered whether she should just stand there and watch without doing anything. The small vial contained blood, and there should have been enough of it to reveal all its magical properties. Since the Duke probably didn't intend to kill his ex-wife so easily, she thought of using black magic to finally die and end everything. In Ariadolina's hands, a glass vial of liquid glimmered, with the help of which she was going to end her torment. But unfortunately, she knew nothing about black magic and did not even know a single symbol with which one could perform the ritual. But the main thing was to do everything in such a way that it looked convincing and that they really thought that she was crazy. One of the maids heard strange sounds and, turning towards Ariadolina's room, could not believe her eyes. No one could understand what had happened, but everything they saw was incredibly frightening. Next to the girl, the maid and butler saw strange, devilish symbols drawn in blood and immediately asked to call the master. But Ariadolina was sure that all the courtiers would fall for her show, and after that she would definitely become crazy for everyone. Seeing this, Carlosian understood what was going on, because all this time he had been racking his brains and could not guess what was happening to the girl. She stood with her bloody hands outstretched near the strange hieroglyph, but it all looks rather strange. He asked Ariadolina why she continued to do such useless things and constantly draw unnecessary attention to herself. And did she really forget how to use black magic correctly, drawing this strange symbol that has nothing to do with it? The Duke calmly informed the courtiers that it seemed the lady was doing this because of mental problems, and there was no need to make too much noise about what had happened. Ariadolina worked so hard to collect all that blood, but it all went down the drain again and no one believed her. She was sure that the bloody walls would somehow affect the young master, but this time too, he remained cool. He took the girl by the hand and said that he would need to spend a little time with her. Having called the court physician, the young man decided to take care of the girl's wounds, but Ariadolina did not want everything to turn out this way. The Duke grabbed her hand again and led her somewhere. She again did not understand where he was going to take her. He held the girl's bloody wrist tightly, as if he was afraid that she might run away again. The lady hurried after him down the corridor, but at some point she stopped and made it clear to him that it was not so easy for her to keep up with him. She pointed to her wrist and looked into his eyes, trying to explain that her hands hurt a lot. The Duke turned around and declared that he sincerely did not understand why the girl constantly did things that hurt her. But Ariadolina was sure that all this time she tolerated his antics because she thought that he could kill her. He asked the girl to follow him, but the indignant Ariadolina did not think that she was probably a dog and always followed the Duke's lead. She felt that this time the young man did not want to harm her, and his thoughts were pure and sincere. A doctor immediately arrived at the Duke's palace to examine the guest, and after a while everything was ready. She looked in the mirror and saw that the old scar on her neck was still visible, but the fresh scars on her face had healed just perfectly. Seeing her reflection in the mirror, she could not believe that just recently her entire face was disfigured, but now she looks beautiful and well-groomed. The maids came up to her and asked the girl to come with them, and they were clearly going to do something. But instead of more disappointment, Ariadolina experienced only a pleasant sensation, because the maids prepared a hot bath for her, and she felt like a cat being carefully washed. After bathing, the lady was taken to a new room and asked to stay in it, which meant that this room would certainly become her home. Ariadilina thought for a moment that the maids were fussing around her too much, and perhaps she could become an unpleasant burden to them. She was worried that others considered her a burden, and in such a situation she did not want to bother anyone. In Ariadilina's head, everything was going wrong again, but the prudent maids took all the knives from the room and noticed that the lady was behaving rather strangely. Before, when Ariadilina lived here, none of the maids hated her, but sometimes she was a little annoying. But here no one ever punished the maids like they did in other families. And when one of the maids cut her hand, Ariadilina immediately made sure that she received prompt treatment. And probably she just got tired of the Duke's actions and eventually just lost her mind and went crazy. The maids decided that they would serve their mistress in such a way that she would feel as good as possible here, but Ariadilina's strange behavior did not end there, and now someone was constantly shouting in the mansion. All the courtiers were already accustomed to such things, and none of them reacted strongly to the cries of the enraged girls. Each time they slowly headed to the master's office, telling about what Lady Ariadilina had already arranged again. The Duke was already so tired that he was not surprised that the girl, even after a short time, repeated the actions again and tried to die again. This time she broke the dishes, held a straw doll and a notepad with words for the maids to call the Duke immediately. There were broken pieces all around Ariadilina. It was too dangerous to approach her, and besides, she had a cursed doll in her hands. One of the maids ran for a broom to clean up the shards before the lady could injure herself on them. The screaming lady was surrounded on all sides by the maid and the butler, and each of them tried not to come closer so as not to be cursed. Ariadilina tried again to draw attention to herself and her desires, trying to say something to the Duke. One of the maids began to clean up the shards, but unfortunately she cut herself on one of them, and water began to drip from her fingers onto her white apron. As soon as Ariadilina saw the cut on the maid, she did not notice how she herself stood on a sharp splinter and seriously injured her leg. Ariadilina didn't even notice that a sharp splinter had pierced her leg because she saw that the maid was in trouble. Blood was oozing from her finger. She understood that if she had not broken the shards, the maid would not have been hurt, and it was only her fault, so Ariadilina immediately asked the maid for forgiveness. She just wanted someone to pay attention to her opinion, but now she was truly sorry that a living person could get hurt because of her actions. The maid tried to convince Ariadilina that now was not the time to worry about her, but the Duke had already appeared behind her, seeing how the girl had messed up again. The young man immediately noticed the lady's bare feet covered in Ariadilina's blood, and at that moment, he was not going to hesitate. He quickly approached the girl and, taking her by the waist, lifted her into the air so that she would not rest her bloody foot on the floor. Ariadilina was drowning in the darkness of Carloshan's eyes, seeing in them a reflection of her fears and hopes. Each of them felt an invisible connection between them, full of deep understanding and hidden emotions. Ariana pointed to the wounded maid and tried to explain that the girl was wounded and needed emergency help. But lifting the girl up in his arms, the Duke asked her if she even knew what condition her legs were in, from which a strong stream of blood was flowing onto the floor. Even with her injured legs, Ariadilina's first thought was of the other person who was injured because of her. The Duke asked the frightened maid to follow them, holding the fragile Ariadilina in her arms the whole time. They immediately rushed to the doctor and reported that the two girls urgently needed treatment. Ariadilina slapped the Duke on the back and tried to show that the maid needed help first and that the situation was more urgent. Carladian asked the maid to go to the doctor and get treatment first, since Ariadilina wanted it very much, and it was useless to argue with her. The maid could not afford to go first, but the Duke insisted that the lady should no longer hesitate and carry out his order. The maid's cut was deep, but Ariadilina's legs were in even worse shape, with shards of glass lodged deep in her wounds that needed to be removed before treatment could be done. The doctor asked the girl to be patient for a little while because removing the fragments would be very painful, but they needed to be removed urgently. Carloshan noticed that even though the girl was in great pain, she still put the treatment of others above her own well-being. While the doctor carefully removed the fragments from behind the girl's feet, she held the young gentleman's hand tightly, and at that moment it helped her a lot. After some time, everything was ready, and the doctor reported that Lady Ariadilina began to come often with wounds. Ariadalina was very worried that they were constantly bothering the healer, and each time she had some new injuries. Carlosian asked if Ariadalina was going to have more of these tantrums today that would require the help of a doctor. Ariadalina looked menacingly at the young man, because it was because of him that she was still alive and he would not let her die in peace. And if he had taken decisive measures a long time ago, he would not have had such problems. But Carlosian was sure that the best idea would be to tie up the girl in her own room. There were still shards of glass scattered around the bedroom, and the maid announced that she was going to go and clean up. But the hero of the occasion did not want anyone else to get hurt, so she became indignant and was going to get rid of the broken dishes herself. The Duke declared that because of the young lady's behavior, the work was being done poorly, and neither he nor the servants could do anything. He came to the door and warned that people were coming tomorrow, so the girl should behave decently and not do anything like that in the presence of the guests. Ariadalina was surprised at what kind of guests were going to visit them, and surely there would be a gala event tomorrow. Carlosian had ordered her to behave decently. All the servants were busy preparing for the reception of guests, so the lady thought that today she would not be watched so closely. So now was the perfect time for Ariadalina to finally sort out her plans without supervision. She walked along the dark corridor and noticed that no matter how many guests came, the Duke would probably increase security. But there was no security at all throughout the estate, and the door to the Duke's office was unlocked. Standing near the door, Ariadalina heard a terrible sound and immediately dared to go out to make sure that everything was in perfect order in the room. She heard strange moans, but this voice was painfully familiar to her, and it definitely belonged to a man. Entering the room, she saw Carlosian kneeling on the floor in front of her, holding tightly to some sheet with his hands and making frightening sounds. It turned out that the young man was not himself at all, or at that moment he was very ill from unbearable pain. His eyes were clouded and his expression looked predatory and bestial, as if a beastly rage was raging within the young man. There were many rumors about the Duke in the Empire, and Ariadalina knew some of them. And now it was clear that the rumors were true, and this young man really did suffer from a mental illness. Suddenly, memories from the past surfaced in Ariadalina's mind, and she clearly remembered the time when they lived in separate bedrooms. Carlosian lived in the farthest room on the top floor, Ariadalina in the room on the opposite side of the lower floor. Carlosian forbade his wife to enter his room, while Ariadalina, with her strong sense of pride, never even tried to go there. She thought that if she entered his bedroom right now, the Duke would definitely hate her. The young man noticed that the girl was standing in the doorway, and in a hoarse voice rudely told her to leave there and leave him alone. He felt the pain and anger slowly eating away at him inside, and he knew he couldn't go on like this any longer. Anger gradually grew, filling every good cell of his cold soul. Ariadalina was speechless in an instant. She knew that something was wrong with him. She saw how he was overcome with rage and despair, how he was losing his peace, fighting with his inner demons. It must have had something to do with the glowing sword, and the rumor that his master was becoming mentally ill over the years seemed to be true. In that case, Ariadalina now completely did not understand what the point was of her knowing the original story, because in fact it was completely useless. Ariadalina, standing in front of him, looked with alarm into his eyes, full of fear and confusion. She knew that his decision was driven not only by his condition, but also by his desire to protect her. Every word was filled with deep sadness. Carlosian understood that by leaving her, he was causing her pain. The enraged young man continued to shout louder and louder, forcing the girl to immediately leave the room. Ariadalina had the option of taking advantage of someone who was suffering, and at that moment she felt a slight pain in her heart. But now the young man was in a terrible state, and she could use this to her advantage. After all, the young man was so angry that he really could not restrain his angry impulses right now and finally kill Irina. The lady stroked the Duke's face, and he did not understand her behavior because she seemed not to hear his words at all and did everything exactly the opposite. Ariadalina was unsure of what it was like to have a mental illness, and she wanted to convey her thoughts clearly to the young master. She gently ran her hand over the young man's face, and it seemed that his anger gradually calmed down until he was at a loss. She wanted to know if it was painful, or if a person was simply controlled by impulses, and in this state he felt absolutely nothing. He knew these weren't just thoughts. These were dark shadows that haunted him, tempting and pushing him towards a terrible decision. She saw only his suffering, his struggle with his inner demons, but she did not know that these demons whispered to him of violence and destruction. She looked into his eyes and asked if he was so angry that he was even ready to kill her right now. Ariadalina insisted that if he listened to his voice and killed her, then he would finally be able to spend his first peaceful night and breathe a sigh of relief. He looked into Ariadalina's eyes, and his own darkness was reflected in them. The young man asked if the girl was really determined to leave this world and so desperately wanted to die, using all possible options. While he held her by the throat with his rough male hand, she looked into his eyes and smiled sweetly, as if she was finally preparing to leave this world and find happiness in another reincarnation. The voice in the Duke's head still asked him to kill the girl so that she would never appear near him again. He screamed loudly to make the voices in his head finally stop, because with each passing second he was losing more and more control over his body and mind. Ariadalina mentally asked that Carlothian not loosen his grip under any circumstances, but squeeze her throat even tighter, cutting off the flow of air. Carlothian felt his mind begin to crack at the seams, and an inner voice seemed to leave him no choice. Every step he took was filled with pain and regret. He knew his inner demons would not leave him alone, but he couldn't let them hurt the one he loved. Ariadalina's trembling, bandaged hand reached out to touch the face of the young master, who still had his hands on her neck. She assured him that everything was fine and that Carlothian had nothing to worry about, since he had done nothing terrible. And everything that was happening to him now was completely not his fault, and Ariadalina was sure of it. She squeezed his hands tighter around her throat and knew that she alone was to blame for everything that was happening now, but she just wanted to die and not cause problems for anyone anymore. In the deep, dark night, Ariadalina's body finally stopped breathing, and Carlothian's hands still tightly squeezed her fragile neck. This time, she was sure that everything would end, and she would no longer have to experience the terrible torments of rebirth and death. On the same day, in one of the autumn forests, a young girl in a black robe appeared on the grass, and there were large bloodstains on her chest. Opening her eyes, Ariadalina realized that she had somehow come back to life and found herself in an unknown place. Looking at her bloody palm, she realized that he had a deep wound on his stomach. This time, Ariadalina really hoped that she would not be able to be reborn again, but now she was again lying bloody and exhausted somewhere in the forest. She probably returned at the moment when Carlothian pulled out a sharp sword and stabbed her in the stomach, but for some reason, Ariadalina was alive again. She came back, but for some reason it wasn't what she wanted, and there was only one feeling pounding in her mind: emptiness. In the forest, the girl lost consciousness again, but as soon as she came to, she realized that she was again in the temple, and the Duke was sitting right in front of her. But fear was growing inside her, fear that her return would not bring him peace, but would only add another chain to his burden. Her heart was filled with longing, the realization that if she saw him again, she might once again become the target of his inner discord. She was sure that last time Dorothy was next to her, but for some reason now the past had changed. It was very strange, because previously the past had always been unchanged, and surely some actions had influenced this. At least one thing was clear, that the Duke had taken care of the young girl, and now he was interested in her condition. Suddenly, Ariadalina said how the young gentleman had the audacity to behave like that, and a moment's pause hung over them. The girl just opened her mouth and spoke words with her own voice, although her voice had been crippled before. The girl shuddered in surprise and grabbed her family, because she had not been able to utter a single word for a long time. She jumped out of bed and ran forward, feeling like her throat was still a little sore, but now she needed to check something. Running to the mirror, Ariadalina removed the bandage from her neck and saw that the scar on her neck was gradually disappearing. After a long silence, the first thing Ariadalina did was laugh loudly, because she had not heard her own ringing voice for a long time. And that meant she could sing again, even if only a little, and she was incredibly happy to just be able to talk again. Ariadalina had many questions about why she could speak again and why the scar on her neck was gradually disappearing. And she clearly felt that this rebirth was definitely different from the past, and this was the first time that she experienced a completely different rebirth. Perhaps this happened because someone else killed her, or because the Duke himself killed her. Ariadalina didn't quite understand, but this man could definitely be her key to repeated reincarnations. There were many things that were not described in the novel, but Ariadilina was not sure, but she felt a wild desire to figure everything out and double-check everything again. Once upon a time, Carlothian had been her husband, but now he was only in the status of a former ally. And in order to finally figure everything out and take advantage of this chance, Ariadilina asked the young master to kill her again, because it was necessary for the Duke to do it. Since he was the only key to her reincarnation, Ariadilina asked to do it quickly and right now. After she said a few words, a sharp pain spread through her throat and the girl suddenly began to cough up blood. This meant one thing: it seemed that she had not yet fully recovered, and each reincarnation affected her physical body. The Duke wiped the blood from the girl's face with a handkerchief and told her that he had definitely killed her, and there was no point in repeating it again. Then he clearly realized that it was possible to go back to the past, but he did not understand how this could be reality. And Ariadilina had only one option, that this time she was reborn into a new life alone. Together with Carlothian, who somehow also remembered his past lives and now ended up here. But none of them could be sure of anything now and did not know specifically how what had happened became reality. Carlothian suggested that they sit down together in a quiet environment and talk about what they had wanted to say to each other for a long time. He handed her a notepad and a pen and asked her to use a piece of paper so as not to strain her throat. Carlothian also didn't know why he was involved in this rebirth, but he saw that Ariadilina was completely calm. Since this was not her first reincarnation, and she had returned to the past many times, the change of worlds was not something surprising for her. The Duke was interested in how many times the girl returned to the past, and she stopped counting after 50 times. The Duke could not accept that he had just heard her words, because everything she said seemed simply unreal. Attack Duke. I got into the past for the first time. He was in a painful state and did not understand what was already happening here. No one understood why he came back with Ariana, and there are probably two reasons. The first is that he killed her, and this is the most likely version. And there is also a second one, and perhaps everything that happened was influenced by his mental illness, which reached its peak. And now they have to figure out what was the real reason for the Duke's entry into his past life. Ariadilina remembered that before she died, the Duke's smaller figure glowed pink. That evening the sword shone throughout the room, and the Duke did suffer from mental illness, and perhaps it was not because he killed the girl. Perhaps he is also simply connected to her constant reincarnations, but this time something went wrong. Before this, Ariadilina had always killed herself, and this was the first time she had been killed by someone else, so the reason they returned together was because Carlothian took her life with his own sword. This turned out to be the most likely theory, and Ariadilina prepared to listen attentively to the Duke's suggestion. In response, he was very surprised that all this time the girl had been taking her own life, and this was not her only time. Ariadilina didn't want anyone to dig into her soul now, because this topic was the most painful for her. And it didn't matter, because now there was something they needed to double-check, because in any case the Duke would have to kill her again. He couldn't believe that all this time, every time Ariadilina died, she was reborn and returned back about 100 times. She sighed, trying to calm her anxiety, but only felt it grow stronger. Ariadilina tried to pull herself together and calmly explain to the young gentleman that her ex-husband still plays a huge role in her life, and he is the only one who can help her make sure that she is never reborn again and does not experience suffering. She confessed that after this rebirth, she realized that perhaps the young man could break this cursed fate. The heroine still believed that she could stop her reincarnations and again asked the venerable Duke to help take her life, but he rudely replied that the girl should not ask him to do this anymore. The Duke said he did not want to become the husband who killed his wife, and that would be a heavy burden for him. At that moment, Ariadilina remembered with alarm in her heart that Carlothian had an incredibly painful past, when one night in the darkness of his bedroom he saw a terrifying picture. The Denabes family was one of the ducal families of the empire. The father of Charles Dien, named Atrafa, had accomplished great deeds in the previous war, and after the great deed, he earned the honor of being awarded the imperial sword to the slot, which was presented to him by the personal emperor. But after receiving this ball, the most terrible tragedy happened in the family. One night, a boy entered his parents' room and saw his father trying to strangle his own mother. At that time, the man was consumed by mental illness and strangled his beloved wife in front of his own son, Carlosian. This event was the most terrible in the boy's life, and he did not understand why his father was so cruel. He held her neck tightly while the boy screamed for his dad to stop immediately and stop doing this. He ran to him and grabbed his hand, hoping that the man would come to his senses and let his wife go, but it turned out that the man was possessed by something. The father pushed the boy away with all his strength, so much so that he fell to the floor with a crash and even hit his head. Mother saw all this, but could do nothing, and only wanted all her suffering to immediately end. She asked the boy to quickly return to his room, and in just a second he hid under the bed, and from fear the boy did not even have the strength to stand up, and he could do nothing except cry quietly. Little Carlocian's breathing seemed to stop as he lay under the bed and heard his father mocking his mother. At that age, the boy could not understand why this was happening, but his father was not the worst person in the world. He heard his mother's quiet voice, insisting that her husband was not guilty of anything and should not blame himself. She stroked his face with her hand, and even now, when he was trying to love him, she still loved him. While the lady was whispering words of love to her husband, the boy sat under the bed and cried because he could not change anything at all. In the room filled with silence after he heard his mother's last words, all that was left was his father's heavy breathing, which he had never heard before, and he could only pray that his father would come to his senses. Finally, with the dawn, when the first sun illuminated the room, a cry of despair echoed throughout the room, and it became clear that sanity had returned to the father. Now the boy saw before him again a loving father, not the terrible demon who had strangled his mother the previous night. It was obvious that the father was completely perplexed, and he stood silently looking at the boy with guilty eyes. The boy called his father, and as soon as he saw the young man in the room and seeing all this horror, he made a radical decision. He didn't even have time to turn around, and the boy saw only his silhouette in a white shirt liquefying in the window. The excited boy did not understand what had just happened, because his father had just been here. But in an instant he disappeared somewhere and left him alone, jumping out of the window of the mansion. Carlosian carefully approached his mother's bed and saw that her body was still lying on the bed where he and his father had just recently slept peacefully. At that moment, the butlers and maids burst into the bedroom, shouting what had happened here last night. They saw the Duchess lying on the bed, and next to her on the floor lay a little boy crying bitterly. It was a family tragedy, and as described in the original, it refers to the incident where the Duke, exhausted by the traumas of war, killed his wife and then committed suicide. And only now did Ariadolina remember such an important thing. The Duke's childhood had left indelible marks of pain on him, and his soul was still full of anxiety and fear. She remembered his eyes, full of deep pain and inner struggle. The people took the young man's hands in theirs and sincerely asked for forgiveness for everything she had done, and for all the pain she had caused the young master with her actions. Ariadolina truly felt sorry, because if she had known the young master's past, she would never have allowed herself to behave like that. She didn't know what was waiting for her ahead, but one thing was clear: she was ready to face it. The Duke did not understand why the lady decided to apologize to him right now, because nothing strange was happening. Doubt flashed in Carlosian's eyes, and suddenly he admitted that Ariadolina had never been like this before. The heroine wanted to help him, to become the light that would dispel the darkness of his thoughts, and at the same time her own excitement prevented her from concentrating. She didn't know how to explain everything that had happened, and even if she said that she was not an Aryan, the Duke would never believe her. But she was sure that the Duke knew and thought nothing of her, and now she wanted to hear his opinion. She asked if he really didn't care what she was really like, and to say that it didn't hurt her at all would be a complete lie. The next word that Carlosian said pierced the girl to the depths of her soul, and it was the word pain. He believed that everything he had ever done for Ariadolina was just pain, and now he wanted to know what she felt in those moments. Ariadolina admitted that she had indeed been indifferent to the young master all this time when they were married. But now something seemed to have changed in the Duke's soul, and he wanted to understand everything in order to understand how to follow the call of his heart. When everything was completely fine with him, strange things began to happen between him and his wife. Ariadolina laughed and stated that she was already used to the young master's antics, so he need not worry. At that moment, she realized that it was her feelings that could become the bridge that would connect their two worlds, light and dark. All the time after the rebirth, Ariadalina from the heroine's memories was an insidious villain who did not give peace to any resident of the estate. She was a person who always enjoyed tormenting others, and she especially enjoyed bullying the weak. Throughout his marriage to the venerable Duke, he never once felt the desire to see her from another side. But now he seemed to see in her a completely different person, with whom everything was completely fine, and this person treated other people with respect, sincerity, and kindness. Doubts tormented the young gentleman's head because everything that had happened was very strange, and Ariadalina's behavior was still surprising to him. Un said that he would tell the high priest that they were going to take her with them, but if she stayed here, the priest would continue to mistreat her. The Duke left the girl's room and went to the high priest to inform him of his final decision. He wondered if everything that happened was really his fault, and Ariadalina didn't want to live because of him, but after this reincarnation, she changed a lot. Her expression became so soft that it didn't suit the title of the Empire's villain, and now she seemed completely different, surrounded by a kind magical aura. Being sure of this, Carloshan realized that now he had to make completely different decisions. On his way, he met a princess who all this time did not know how the girl felt and what was happening to her. She was very glad to see the Duke, who immediately informed her that Ariadalina seemed to be doing quite well. The lady admitted that she was very worried and even did not sleep for several nights waiting for some news. The Duke decided to immediately inquire what kind of person Ariadalina was for the Dorothy, since they had been in a relationship for many years. Dorothy did not understand why the Duke decided to clarify this issue right now, but he urgently needed her opinion. Dorothy laughed and said that as soon as she met the lady, she always looked to her like an abandoned, aggressive kitten, because she is constantly on guard and hissing, and this is exactly how a kitten reacts to a stranger, and this comparison is very funny for her. But in reality, everything Ariadalina did was an attempt to avoid her own unbearable mental pain. She could only strike first to defend herself, and that was precisely why she behaved so unworthy. Dorothy felt that every time Ariadalina deliberately hurt her, she still looked unhappy, as if something made her do it. There was no joy in her eyes from violence or majestic power, but only deep sadness and doomed melancholy. There were times when Dorothea was also offended by her, and even saints are not always kind and sincere, and once, due to Ariadalina's fault, she even had to apply a curse. All people are incredibly different, but everyone has their own motives for actions and the feelings that fill them. But there are no completely bad people, because everyone has their own mental trauma and heart. At least the Duke was sure of it, and Ariadalina was for him a person who committed terrible deeds, but her soul and heart were sincere and kind. Dorothy was worried that the Duke and she had not noticed her condition earlier, and they certainly could have helped her with something beforehand. Ariadalina probably also regretted a lot of things, so the princess asked the Duke to give her another chance, and this time everything would definitely change. But once the young man had already killed the girl with his own hands, and now he had to act differently. Carlodian couldn't stop thinking about Ariadalina, and the bright smile on her face wouldn't leave his head. His mind was torn between desire and fear, and he felt trapped by his own choices. When Ariadalina arrived at the Carlosian estate, kind people helped her take a bath and escorted her to her room. But after numerous reincarnations, the lady finally realized that she had experienced too many events during all this time. But now she needed a little time to think things over because she couldn't leave her voice in that state. After some time, Ariadalina woke up from a wild pain that engulfed her entire body, piercing every cell. She was curled up on the bed in severe pain, and her head felt like it was splitting into hundreds of little pieces. Suddenly, she heard many voices in her head, which claimed that she hated the Duke and must definitely kill him, and this voice filled the girl's mind more and more with each passing second. All this time, the Duke had been closely watching Ariadalina's behavior, and today he was surprised that she had gone to her bedroom at such an early hour. The butler reported that the lady had gone to bed before sunset, and this was so unexpected for everyone. He asked for today's medicine to be prepared, and the butler respectfully went to fulfill the master's request. Carlottian didn't understand why this was happening right now and right after the full moon, because they say that mental illnesses become incredibly aggravated at this time. And today he will be able to sleep only if he takes medicine, but still this solution was temporary and it is necessary to find another way. Just as the Duke thought about this, he saw a magical light coming from a sword near his desk. He clearly saw that the most precious stone on the ball was emitting a magical light, and it was becoming brighter and brighter. As soon as the sword started to flash, it meant that mental illness was approaching the young master, but now even the first symptoms had not appeared. Suddenly the butler ran through the door and shouted loudly that something had happened, and it required the master's immediate attention. As it turned out, that night, Madame suddenly developed the first symptoms, and Hertz could not believe what he heard, because it could not be. He ran into the girl's bedroom and saw how the courtiers were trying to cope with her, and she was screaming loudly that she was feeling hellish pain. The lady was crying so hard that her screams could be heard even in the distant parts of the mansion, and this scream was completely unlike human. I clearly understood that Ariadalina showed the same symptoms of mental illness, and she could harm herself. The young man came up and grabbed her hands, calling her by name. I understand that now he will have to stop her by any means necessary. Ariadalina sat in tears and could not even pronounce the Duke's name, but only tearfully begged him for help with her eyes. That evening, those eyes showed themselves to be familiar to the girl, the eyes of someone who was suffering just like him. And the Duke only reproached himself for the fact that he should have understood immediately when she mentioned the connection between degeneration and mental illness. The butler at that very moment brought the Duke the medicine that had to be taken during each attack. Carlottian held the bottle up to the girl's face and asked her to drink it immediately, assuring her that it would help relieve the severe pain. For Ariadalina, the pain was so unbearable that she completely lost her mind and did not understand what was happening around her. The Duke understood that he would have to use force to make him drink even one sip of the medicine, which should take effect immediately. That is why he asked all the servants to quickly leave the room, because only he could help this innocent girl. He unscrewed the cap of the bottle and understood that if this continued, Ariadalina could go completely crazy. So he took a sip of the medicine and kissed the girl so that the medicine would also get into her mouth, because she categorically refused to take it on her own, but she was running out of time. While the Duke was on the girl's lips, Ariadalina completely forgot that she had recently been seized by wild hysteria. The Duke finally managed to pour the potion into the girl's mouth, and it should soon take effect. The girl's body began to gradually weaken, and with each passing minute, Carlottian felt that it was becoming easier for her to breathe. And now they needed a little time for Ariadalina to come to her senses after the wild emotional stress. The medicine didn't work instantly, but it will still help you calm down quickly. Ariadalina buried her face in the chest of the young man with whom she had experienced a huge number of emotions and shocks throughout her life. She screamed that it was he who made her so unhappy, hitting the young man in the chest with her fists, hoping that he would someday understand something. All she needed was for him to look at her at least once with kindness and love, like he had before. Ariadalina began to cry loudly again and asked the young man to listen to her words at least once and understand her feelings, and not be so cold. She continued to hit him with her fists, but the next second she seemed to weaken and sat down in front of him, her sad eyes directed forward. And today, Ariadalina asked for only one thing: that Carlottian would simply love her as before, with care and trepidation, respect and prudence, and never let her go again. This time, Ariadalina was absolutely sure that it was all over, and she had messed everything up again, but this morning she finally felt Carlottian's warmth. And it would probably have been much easier for the girl if these disturbing memories had simply disappeared from her memory, but she clearly remembered every moment. In order for Ariadalina to drink the medicine, the Duke took it into his mouth and then kissed the lady, and he probably did this only for medicinal purposes. But the worst thing was that Ariadalina actually told the Duke that she wanted him to love her with a pure and sincere love. The girl jumped out of bed and was indignant. How could she even think such a thing, and even more so say it personally to the Duke, and probably this body still had the memories of its former owner. The Duke noticed that it seemed that Ariadalina had already woken up a long time ago, and now the lady was afraid that he might misunderstand her. So she decided to pretend that nothing had happened, that she didn't remember anything, and the first thing she asked was what had happened between them yesterday. Karlochin looked at the girl silently, surprised that she was asking such strange questions. He asked her if she remembered anything about the previous night, and Ariadalina insisted that she had no memory whatsoever. There were strange cuts on the Duke's hands, and Ariadalina was afraid that she might have hurt him and forgotten everything. The Duke offered to take up the treatment, but Ariadalina wanted to know if something really bad had happened last night. The Duke asked her to look at her lessons, and maybe then her memory would return faster. Ariadalina looked at her palms, which were covered with bruises and abrasions, but she remembered absolutely nothing. The doctor came into the room and carefully examined the girl's hands and also checked her overall condition. The Duke noticed that Ariadalina had long since stopped coughing, and it seemed that her throat no longer bothered her. Touching her neck, the girl only now realized that the Duke was indeed right. Ariadalina politely asked the doctor for a mirror to see what was happening to her scar. She carefully removed the white satin bandage from herself and saw that the scar was definitely disappearing, although this time it was definitely not because of the Duke. She tried to pronounce the vowel to feel if her throat still hurt as much as before. She clearly felt that the pain had significantly subsided, but as soon as she tried to make herself louder, she began to cough violently. Suddenly the Duke asked. Ariadalina was very worried about her voice, and he would like to know the reason for such worry. Ariadalina said that if her throat heals, she will be able to sing again and do what she loves. Now that the treatment was over, they needed to return to discuss many things. The first thing Karlochin wanted to talk about at the table was mental illness, and to think about why it was transmitted to his girlfriend at the moment when he wounded her with a sword. The symptoms began to manifest after returning to the past with the Duke, and Ariadalina was simply trying to state the facts while the Duke could not put anything together in his mind. She asked him to tell her more about the sword, and perhaps this sword was connected to a strange mental illness. According to the Duke, the sword was completely imbued with evil black magic and was intended only to do evil. In reality, it looked like an ordinary sword, but at night it emitted dark magic that permeated this world. If you remember, the heroine was already associated with black magic because she had previously used it on Princess Dorothée. The heroine admitted that she did not curse the saint and did not do this, and had to clarify this once and for all, so that no one else would dare to think about her like that. In their conversation with the Duke, they returned to the previous topic again, and in his opinion, Ariadalina still could not admit much. The Duke loudly put his mug down on the table and declared that he did not want to hear anything more about that girl in her defense. He looked at her menacingly in the eyes and told her to get out of there immediately, and that he didn't want to hear another word from her. Ariadalina stopped dead in her tracks, and the Duke's loud words struck her like lightning. She left the office and decided that she had enough, and when it came to Dorothée, the Duke began to completely ignore her words, and she understood perfectly well why he was angry. He was probably just pretending to give the girl a chance, but he could at least pretend that he still believed her. But everything does not happen as Ariadalina had imagined, and the cold-blooded Duke continued to behave ruthlessly. The events of this day unfold in the majestic imperial palace, where something interesting happens every day. The venerable lady's favorite flowers were yellow roses, which always decorated her room. In the imperial palace there lived a fragile princess named Elmondi Borovicia, and from early morning she called one of the maids to talk to her. The maid said that she had heard that Ariadalina had returned to the capital, but the princess was interested in what had already happened next. There were rumors that she was staying at Duke de Nabas's mansion, and that she was last seen there. The maid told her about all the latest rumors and bowed her head low so that the mistress would not think to be angry with her. The princess was surprised that Karlothian had really given shelter to that hated woman, and it was truly amazing. Rumors of the engagement between the princess and the Duke quickly spread throughout the empire, from the palace to the smallest villages. The princess thought that if rumors started, the Duke might listen to them, but it turned out differently. If the engagement does not take place, the emperor will intervene, and he values the prestige of the imperial family above all else. In order to preserve the dignity of the princess, he will do everything possible to ensure that the engagement takes place. But the saddest thing was that at such an important time, the Duke brought his ex-wife to his mansion. The princess asked to bring from the secret storage the item that she now incredibly needed. She was going to deal with this girl once and for all, so that she would never dare to stand in her way again. The girl tore the fragile yellow rose apart with her hands, and its petals slowly fell to the floor as the princess prepared to eliminate her rival. Some time had already passed, but no matter how much Ariadilena thought about what was happening, she could not resign herself and leave everything as it was. That princess from her memories was the real culprit, and it would be great if the real Ariadilena could curse them. For this reason, the girl thought about dark magic and decided that she should definitely learn more about it. As soon as Ariadilena thought about dark magic, a loud sound seemed to sound in her head, and for a moment she stopped breathing. Suddenly she heard a voice in her head. It was the voice of a young girl whom she seemed to know very well. This voice was similar to Ariadilena's voice, and probably the past heroine somehow wanted to help the girl who was now living her life in her body. Suddenly, Ariadilena began to pronounce strange words that she had definitely never heard or known before. These words were like an ancient magical language, and at that moment the heroine had no control over her voice at all. She was very surprised, because upon hearing the words spoken from her lips, the girl was overcome with wild excitement. Because all this time her mouth was moving on its own and uttering strange magic spells. And how inopportunely the Duke appeared next to her, who caught the girl reading strange spells, who had previously claimed that she was innocent and did not know black magic. The Duke thought that the lady was trying to curse Dorothea again, but Ariadilena was trying to justify herself. Ariadilena was surprised that the Duke still thought that way about her, that she had deceived him and cursed the princess. She could not mistake this contemptuous look for anything, and this was probably all that Ariadilena saw in her family life. Ariadilena once again insistently repeated that it was not her. If she finds the real culprit, what will the Duke do in that case? The young man laughed and said that if the girl managed to find the culprit, then he was ready to kneel before her and asked her to remember these words. She was going to prove that she was not involved in dark magic, and even more so, did not try to harm the princess. The girl had been feeling quite well all day, but now, in one moment, it was as if all her feelings and mind had turned upside down. She completely forgot that as soon as the sun sets below the horizon, new severe torments await her, and mental illness takes hold of her completely as soon as the moon descends into the sky. The last thing the girl saw was the Duke loudly shouting her name, but then she remembered absolutely nothing. She woke up from a strong, excruciating pain that pierced her chest and did not subside for a second. The Duke carefully treated the girl's wound and said that it would hurt for some time, and she would have to be patient, but she needed to take medication every day. But because of the wild pain, Ariadilena did not hear the words of the young master, but only screamed for him to immediately close his mouth. Suddenly, she threw herself into his arms with all her might, as if seeking the protection and support she had been waiting for many years. The Duke felt that the girl was getting worse, asking her to wait a little and be patient, believing that the severe pain would soon subside. At that moment, Ariadilena asked the Duke to kill her with his own hands if he could never love her again. And the reason for everything was Ariadilena's tremulous feelings for the Duke, who never gave her a chance for reciprocal love. Ariadilena looked tenderly into the Duke's eyes and called him her most beloved person, who truly became like family to her. She wrapped her arms carefully around his neck and informed him that she would only tell him this information once, and that he should listen carefully. She leaned closer to his ear and whispered that all her suffering and death happened only because of him. Due to her mental illness, Ariadilena had memory lapses, and after a couple of hours, she truly regretted what she had done. She insisted that what happened yesterday was a mistake and, in any case, the young master needed treatment. Taking off his shirt in front of the girl, the Duke quietly declared that he did not need a doctor's examination, but the lady should look and think a little about her behavior. At that moment, the maid Rhody burst into the bedroom and informed the master that important preparations for the meal were underway. But to her surprise, she saw the young Duke tenderly hugging the lady around the waist, and the girl looking with frightened eyes at the servant who entered. Rhody immediately felt embarrassed and began to tearfully beg for forgiveness, because she did not expect that someone would come in at such an inopportune moment. She reported that dinner was almost ready, and Carloshan asked his ex-wife to also get ready for the dining room. At the dinner table, the Duke asked the girl never to do such reckless things again, and had she forgotten how she jumped down the stairs yesterday. Ariadalina insisted that she did not do it on purpose and only felt very dizzy due to illness, so she fell down the stairs. The Duke laughed because she was saying this to someone who has lived with such a disease all his life and knows very well how it goes. This disease has been intensifying hidden resentments and hatreds, and these feelings do not come out of nowhere. Rather, it is a suppressed desire that comes to the surface. And this means that her desperate request for love yesterday was not at all fictitious words or the words of a madwoman. Yesterday, Ariadalina tearfully begged for the Duke to finally love her, and only now did she realize that this was truly her sincere desire, and not only hers, but the previous heroine's. A few days later, Ariadalina continued to think about this situation, but she still could not find any answer. So she walked around all morning, gloomy and lost in her thoughts, when the maids announced the master's imminent arrival. Yesterday, the Duke mentioned that an important guest would arrive today, whom the lady had not met before. But in the distance, she saw a bald man who immediately approached the maid and invited her to have a pleasant time together. She saw that the man behaved in an insolent manner, and by such behavior he dishonored the honor of the Duke, whom he had come to visit. This scoundrel openly pestered every maid who passed by him. He touched them by the waist and did not let them pass, and the agitated maids did not understand what to do with the stranger. The man was Count Doffelman, a skilled businessman, and she had often heard his name when she was a duchess. One of the maids attracted him more than the others, and he began to brazenly ask the girl about her beautiful body. But unfortunately, the maid was just a servant and had to endure any antics so as not to disgrace the name of the duchy, and it is unknown how much longer she would have endured if at that moment Ariadalina had not appeared and loudly called the man by name. Putting his hands on the maid's waist, the man saw Ariadalina and recognized her because he had also heard about this person. This man's gestures were unpleasant. His manner of speech was incredibly rude, and it was completely unpleasant to be around him. Ariadalina didn't even try to fight when the man became even more impudent, but snatched the maid from his strong hands, with which he had just held her by the waist. The man was sure that the naughty girl would be punished, because she had just dared to speak rudely to him. Ariadalina asked the maid to go to the mansion and promised to sort everything out herself. Today the lady was more confident than ever, because everything was in perfect order, and the maid just had to do as usual. The lady was left alone with the impudent man while the maid ran to the other servants to tell them what had happened. Ariadalina felt anger building up inside her, and she stopped, clenching her fists and glaring at the Count. She took a step forward, her presence filling the space with tension. She was determined to end this humiliation, and her voice sounded like a bolt of lightning. This man had long recognized Ariadalina and asked why she was here, and during all this time, the lady had not changed at all. He claimed that she ignored people at the last party, which is why he remembered her that day and they had met before. Ariadalina remembered how this rude young man tried to flirt with her at the ball and was rejected that day. And there was no chance that Ariadalina would be interested in anyone other than Carlosian, and that was probably their plot destiny. The man grabbed her hand without waiting for her answer, because right now he wanted the girl to fulfill his requests or just talk to him. Surely he had shown some sympathy towards her last time, and all this time he could not forget how the fair-haired lady rejected him. Ariadalina didn't want to spend another second with this scoundrel, so she wiped her hand with all her might. The squabble had been going on for a long time, and Ariadalina wanted Carlothian to come quickly and see everything that was happening. But the impudent man continued to pester the girl, and this time he grabbed her soft pink dress and tore off a piece. For some reason, Ariadalina felt excited, but at that moment she realized that she needed to run right now. The enraged man had already managed to stand up and grab the girl by the shoulders, not allowing her to move another step. He asked her if she was upset that the esteemed Duke had not paid attention to her and promised to love her as much as she wanted. But Ariadalina didn't need anyone's love anymore, and she kicked the man in the chest with all her might so that he would finally leave her alone. His voice was loud and rough. He laughed, giving his words a cheeky undertone that seemed to pierce the air around him. Ariana desperately searched for a way out, feeling time dragging on like it was in slow motion. But the man continued to hold her hand and shout that the lady would never be able to leave him again, because she had already fallen into his clutches once. Ariadalina screamed loudly for the man to take his dirty hands off her and pushed him away from her sharply. The man was sure that the girl was crazy and thought too much of herself, but now was the time to take advantage of the opportunity because Ariadalina's dress was completely torn. She shouted loudly the name of the Duke, who was due to appear any minute, and see what his invited guest was doing. A few seconds later, the Duke in a black jacket appeared in front of them and declared that he did not really like noise in his house. He abruptly threw off his jacket so that Ariadalina could cover the torn dress and bruises on his body. At that moment, the maid ran up to the girl and tried to calm her down because it was she who stood up for her. The Duke declared that everything within this estate belonged only to him, and especially the people who were here. But the Count insisted that the girl was a malicious criminal and that she could certainly be treated as one wished. The scoundrel, seeing the Duke's determination and realizing that he had no chance, was about to push him away, but the Duke instantly caught his hand, like a predator seizing its prey. The Duke grabbed the man by the throat and with one sharp movement threw him with all his strength onto the concrete floor. He began to groan and toss and turn, and foam came out of his mouth, and it was clear that the Count had probably broken something. At this point, the Duke repeated once again that one should never touch what belonged to him, and that in the future the guest should learn new rules that should be respected. The man, noticing that the Duke's steely gaze was making him nervous, tried to retreat. And soon he admitted that he had made a huge mistake and had not thought at all about what he was doing towards these girls. The Duke asked the Count never to show his face again and to immediately leave his mansion, forgetting the way here. All this time, the girls sat and watched as the Duke militantly defended his honor, not giving anyone a chance to encroach on his dignity. Ariana quietly thanked the young master for saving her because he appeared at the most necessary second. The Duke took the girl's hands, and now she was finally completely safe when she was next to him. He saw fear in her eyes again, and Ariadalina seemed unable to remain calm ever again. Taking the girl in his arms, the Duke said that first she would need to change her clothes, but the lady did not understand why he was doing this. The maid confessed that this was the only outfit that Madame had, and she had no other dress. As soon as the Duke heard about this, he and Ariadalina went to a famous clothing boutique, which was headed by Madame Rosanna. In order to go to the boutique, she had to borrow a dress from one of the lovely maids, who happily provided the most beautiful outfit. The lady inquired what brought the Duke here, but she doubted, looking at the girl, that their things met her standards. The Duke said menacingly that he had no time for unnecessary talk and that he had come here to buy a good dress. The lady immediately took the girl's measurements and could not understand whether the Duke had divorced his wife. And if it becomes known that she personally sewed a dress for the villain Ariadalina, the store's reputation could suffer greatly. Rosanna took measurements with a measuring tape and warned the lady not to move or get distracted, because taking measurements was very important. The lady smiled and admitted that if Rosanna herself were to sew her a beautiful dress, she would look forward to it with great impatience. And after her words, Rosanna was very surprised. Was Ariadalina always so sweet and polite, because they always spoke as if she were the most cruel villain? She came out to the Duke and warned him that the girl would soon change her clothes, so he should wait a little. Rosanna stood next to the Duke, waiting for the Empire's greatest villain, for whom she had just decided on a dress, to come out. A few minutes later, Ariadalina appeared before the Duke and Rosanna in a completely new guise. The blue satin dress hugged Ariadalina's figure beautifully, giving her grace and sophistication, and the deep color of the dress emphasized her fair skin, creating a wonderful contrast. It seemed that the young gentleman liked the blue color, and Ariadalina looked very bright in this dress. The Duke asked to try on another dress, and Rosanna noted that even if this girl was a criminal, she was still his ex-wife, and the Duke was too cold towards her. Ariana somehow wanted to diffuse the situation and liven up the Duke a little, who sat there with a humble look, like a rock. She continued to reconcile various luxurious dresses, and a few minutes later her attention was caught by a charming red outfit. In the next dress, the girl's shoulder line was simply magnificent, and each dress really emphasized her refined figure. Ariadalina looked beautiful in any dress and was more dazzling than the most expensive diamond, so Rosanna asked to bring all the dresses they had. Rosanna also personally brought out for the girl a particularly pearl necklace with a precious blue stone in the form of a pendant. She admitted that this necklace will highlight Ariadne's elegance, and the blue gemstone is incredibly suitable for her eyes. As soon as Rosanna tried to fasten the necklace around the girl's neck, she saw that her entire body was covered in scars, and she had probably been subjected to cruel treatment due to her status as a criminal. Rosanna wondered why the villainess had changed so much, and it seemed like she had lost her mind forever from the pain. Finally, Ariadne stopped her attention on one of the dresses, in which she looked like a beautiful princess. Ariana liked all the dresses, and Rosanna asked the Duke if he liked anything. He asked to adjust the lace at the bottom of the first dress because Ariadne loves active movement, so it is necessary to use a lighter fabric and change the color of the third and sixth dresses. It turned out that the Duke had been watching closely from the very beginning and even noticed details that the boutique owner herself had forgotten about. The Duke warned that he planned to continue buying clothes from this store and asked someone to send dresses to the estate every month. Even the boutique owner did not expect that the young lady liked the dress so much and was very glad that the Duke agreed to continue collaborating with the boutique. But now was not the time to think, because Ariadne had lost her mind, so their relationship had improved, and Rosanna had to tell everyone for the sake of her store's well-being. You see, the most important thing is that the villain of the empire, Ariadne, had changed, and she herself was convinced of this. The surprises did not end there that day, and upon arrival at the mansion, the Duke had prepared another important event for Ariadne. He confidently declared that from that moment on, Ariadne would live only in his room. The Duke admitted that he had not been able to sleep properly all this time because of the girl's illness, and perhaps it would be better to keep her close. The girl was sure that sharing a room with her ex-wife was rather strange, but the Duke looked very tired, and because of this, she felt guilty. She was genuinely worried about the Duke and asked if he was really okay after everything that had happened. Ariadne asked what Carloshan was going to do if stupid rumors started to circulate about him sharing a bedroom with his ex-wife, since some people were still expecting him to be an heir. But after the Duke's menacing look, Ariadne realized that she no longer wanted to ask him any questions. She was only trying to take care of him, but the Duke asked her to mind her own business and promised to deal with his own himself. The heroine decided that she needed to stop worrying and instead think about the scar on her neck that had been bothering her all this time. Ever since the scar appeared on her neck, Ariadne always wore a beautiful bandage, but now she felt that the scar was healing well. Although she didn't know the exact reason why everything happened, maybe now she would finally be able to speak a little louder and hear her voice. She stepped out onto the balcony, where the rays of bright sunshine were shining, and took a deep breath of fresh air, opening her mouth slightly and preparing to make a sound. Ariadne sang one letter, and her voice was still hoarse and her throat was sore, but most importantly, she could sing again. And these were the most joyful and happy feelings in a long time since Ariadne tried to get her voice back. Standing on the balcony and feeling the warm breeze, she felt like the happiest person on this planet because she could speak again. The Duke, who was below, suddenly heard a quiet, pleasant singing coming from somewhere on the balcony. It was the first time he had heard anyone drinking in this mansion, especially if it was Ariadne. He turned around, saw her standing on the balcony, and noticed that the girl was finally glad that she was just alive, because she was singing a very sweet song about love. Ariadne said she loved to sing, but the Duke thought her changes were just superficial attempts to please the young master. So he closely watched the girl's behavior, but still could not understand her true intentions. Now he saw Ariadne's incredibly happy face as she sang a love song with such an expression on her face, and she must have put her whole soul into this song, imagining herself singing about one special man. There was an important meeting taking place in the Duke's office today, which he decided to end immediately upon his arrival. The surprised guests looked at him, and it seemed as if something had recently happened here that the Duke did not yet know about. The men heard that Lady Ariadne had just performed a song on the balcony, and she had clearly dedicated it to her master. The young man also noticed that the girl was singing from the balcony of the Duke's room, and they realized that they were not sharing one room for two, and that the Duke was probably planning something. Much to Ariadne's misfortune, her voice only lasted for one song, after which she immediately began coughing up blood again. The lady came out from the balcony, and the first thing she saw in front of her was the Duke, who seemed to have been standing there for a long time and waiting for her. Carlosian looked cold-blooded, and he silently looked at the girl with a piercing gaze. At first, Ariadalina was afraid that Carlothian wanted to scold her for something, but in fact, he simply finished work early, and that was why he came here. Carlothian wanted to know what song the girl was singing, because she had made an incredibly pleasant impression on him. Ariadalina smiled sweetly and asked if he heard the song, then surely some thoughts and feelings arose in his head. The Duke seemed not to know what the lady wanted from him, but she was only asking his opinion about the song. The Duke spoke slowly. This song was unusual and sad for him, and everyone knew that the mysterious meaning depended only on the listener. All this time, the young man could not understand what feelings the song brought about, and asked if the girl was really going to continue singing. Ariana thought this question was rather strange, but suddenly the Duke stated that girls probably shouldn't sing in front of other people. Before this, the lady had already thought that the Duke would come specifically to tell her that she had sung poorly, and her thoughts turned out to be justified. So she immediately admitted that she herself didn't really like the song, but unexpectedly the Duke declared that the song was quite good. The Duke even coughed out of embarrassment at the end of his words, but naive Ariadalina thought that he just had a cold. She thanked the Duke for his sincere thoughts and was very glad to hear his opinion. Duke Carlosian looked away awkwardly, as if trying not to meet Ariadalina's eyes. Feelings of admiration and embarrassment were fighting inside him, because he understood that he could not remain indifferent to her charm. Ariadalina didn't know how to take the Duke's reaction, or whether it meant that she hadn't sung well enough, but even so, she was grateful that he was trying to comfort her. The girl went about her business and decided to forget about everything unnecessary, because now she needed to research dark magic. Carlothian closed the door behind him and felt how embarrassment was gripping him, and he thought about the girl more and more often. For a moment, the young man even thought that he was going crazy, because just the thought that the song could be intended for someone else made him incredibly angry. And when Ariadalina sang her first song on the balcony with a happy smile, only he saw her like that. The young man was sure that only he had the right to see her true happiness. But these thoughts turned out to be rather absurd, considering that they had not had any relationship for a long time. The Duke appeared before his ex-wife in an unbuttoned robe, who stared with admiration at his incredibly beautiful body. The lady even looked up from reading an important book as soon as she saw the strong muscles of the young gentleman. Carlothian, it seemed, had not expected that she was still there, and with a cry he pulled his robe shut. The lady insisted that the young man himself had recently offered to let her stay in the room, and now they were making her out to be a fallen girl who was looking at men's bodies. Having quickly changed his clothes, Carlothian turned away from Ariadalina and continued to stand with his back to her, so much so that she even thought that he might be angry with her for something. But she did not understand the reason for his indignation, because he himself asked her to stay and live in his room. The girl was reading a history book with great interest, while Carlothian was surprised that she had not studied it as a child. But probably such privileges were available only to the heirs of the appointed ranks, and ordinary commoners were not allowed to do so. The Duke carefully placed the girl on his lap, and at that moment Ariadalina realized that she was definitely ready for madness. She wanted to know more about this disease and wondered if there was any way to cure it. According to Carlothian, forbidden books were kept in the basement, and one could find something there to read about dark magic. Ariadalina experienced the most tender feelings for the Duke, which seemed to become stronger with every moment as soon as he was near. Coming closer, the girl decided that she could no longer hide her emotions and hugged the Duke, feeling the tension gradually go away. The lady spoke tender words of love to him again, her fragile arms wrapped tightly around his muscular neck. Her embrace was full of warmth and care, and Ariadalina hoped that the Duke would also feel how much he meant to her. The next morning, the heroine woke up again in the young master's bed, and today she clearly felt how, after a night spent with dark magic, the sun was simply blinding. That night she couldn't sleep until dawn again, so she probably needed a little more rest. Having gotten out from under the heavy arm with which the young man was hugging the girl, she remembered that the forbidden books were in the basement. Opening the bedroom door, she immediately met the maid, who asked why the mistress had woken up so early and whether she would like to have breakfast. The heroine didn't want anyone to worry about her anymore, so she asked the maid not to worry and that she would manage on her own. While the girls were talking, they did not notice how a young maid approached them and accidentally knocked over a bucket of water right in front of Ariadne's feet. The girl was frightened and tearfully asked for forgiveness, assuring that she had simply rushed and that it was the same child that Ariadne had seen before. She asked if the girl had made a mistake, since she had just fallen with a heavy bucket of water. But fortunately for the maid, everything was in perfect order, and she did not receive a single abrasion or bruise, but she was incredibly worried that she had spilled a bucket of water right in front of the mistress. Ariadne insisted that there was no need to scold anyone, because the maids worked hard every day and tried to keep the palace clean, warm, and cozy. The maid who spilled the bucket of water was called Rhody, and she was so scared that her voice even trembled. She was sure that the mistress would punish her, but Ariadne only asked to prepare a hot bath for her. After immersing herself in hot water with aromatic oils, Ariadne finally exhaled and realized that she simply had to leave before the Duke woke up. But to her great surprise, the door to the bathroom opened, and as if nothing had happened, the Duke walked in a bathrobe. He froze in place as soon as he saw the girl in the bath, and she was also surprised by his appearance. Seeing Carloshan enter, the girl tried to act naturally and try to change the subject, so she immediately asked if the Duke would like to join in. But in response, he only walked out and slammed the door, leaving the girl alone with her bath procedures. Sitting on the sofa with a menacing look, the Duke asked if the lady always behaved so carelessly. Ariadne was perplexed, because he himself had said to stay in this room, and he himself had just entered without knocking. These circumstances made the heroine a little nervous, because the Duke himself suggested living in the same room, and now he constantly doesn't like something. The maid, seeing the lady, asked worriedly if everything was okay with the master, since the Duke had just entered the bathroom. And she was sure that Ariadne and the Duke should have already established a warm relationship, but nothing was happening between them yet. Having changed into a new dress, all the maids admired how beautiful the mistress looked, like a sweet angel who had come down from heaven. It was an aristocrat's clothing made of expensive fabric, and even the home outfit looked magnificent. While the maid was carefully combing Ariadne's hair, she remembered that a letter had recently arrived for her. As Madame Rosanna said, Ariadne looks so remorseful that she is almost unrecognizable from the past actions that she villainously committed. The aristocrats were sure that Ariadne had sincerely begun to repent of her sins, and they say that even the crown princess had already forgiven her. But the ladies did not understand why the Duke continued to keep her in his house, and whether he really thought of marrying her again. Discussing other people's relationships was a common pastime for aristocratic ladies, and the main topic today was the rumors that the Duke was going to marry the princess. In any case, Ariadne would get what she deserved, and each of the girls was sure of it. One of the ladies who'd been sitting in the center and had been silent all this time finally confessed that she was very curious to see how much the villain Ariadne had changed, and that girl was Dorothy Antrua. Dorothy Antroy was the daughter of the famous Antroy family of counts and had a high position in high society. She was known for her impeccable manners and charm, which were highly valued in Soviet circles. But above all, she was famous for her close friendship with Crown Princess Dorothea, which also contributed to the lady's high status. At tea, one of the girls asked if Dorothy had received an answer from Ariadne to the letter she had sent recently. Dorothy was sure that rumors should not be blindly believed, but apparently Ariadne really repents of her sins. And in response, she even sent a letter with an invitation at the beginning, although she only thought that Ariadne would simply accept the invitation. The girl was most interested in how she would deal with the guests, given her well-known status as a criminal. One of Dorothy's friends insistently asked to take her with her because she was interested in Ariadne and her changes. Dorothy was delighted that her friends wanted to go with her, and if Ariadne was as kind as rumors claimed, she probably wouldn't mind if the number of guests increased a little. On that cool evening on the balcony, Dorothy couldn't understand why the young man was now saying that he wasn't going to be her partner. The venerable Marquis Seth politely stated that he would accompany the Countess and was forced to ask Dorothy's forgiveness. The girl did not understand, because just recently she and the Marquis had agreed that he would be her escort, and now he was radically changing his mind. Dorothy could not understand why the young man chose this particular woman, because she was sure of the sincerity and reciprocity of his feelings. But the Marquis only coldly asked the girl to watch her words, because he was sure that he had already apologized to her enough. And at that moment, Dorothy harbored a strong grudge against Ariadalina, whom she hated and decided that she would never forgive again, and tea drinking in the duchy with her promised to be fun. The maid entered the mistress's room and asked if Lady Ariadalina was ready to appear before the guests. She wore a luxurious sky-blue dress with a thin veil, emphasizing her incredible figure. Ariadalina looked absolutely gorgeous today, but she felt a certain lack of confidence in herself since the lady who sent the letter was initially unknown to her. But now she knew that Dorothy was the very girl whose partner the previous Ariadalina had stolen because she often attended parties with different men. Rumor has it that the scandal with someone else's partner caused quite a stir in Soviet circles, and Ariadalina often found others to save face at the event. The heroine was sure that the Marquis definitely went first, and the heroine simply agreed, and it is unclear why false rumors spread. Now the man who had lost his partner had personally sent an invitation to tea, and Dorothy probably had something in mind, but it was also impolite to answer her. Since she had told the Duke everything, and he had given permission for the tea party to take place, she no longer had any excuses for refusing. But there was another rumor that had been circulating in social circles lately, and Ariadalina was a little worried about it. The maids said, they say, that Lady Ariadalina received forgiveness and became a completely different person, and she no longer finds meaning in her atrocities, and became incredibly kind. And this is how they now talk about her in Soviet circles. It is not good for any high-ranking noble to be the subject of rumors, no matter how good or bad the content. Those rumors were spread by the lady from the dress shop, but Ariadalina was sure that everything was in order, since she was no longer a noblewoman anyway. This tea party must have definitely had some hidden purpose, and soon Dorothy and her friends appeared on the threshold of the ducal mansion. Dorothy brought more guests than had been agreed upon, and the lady admitted that everyone was worried about Ariana and just wanted to see her. The trick didn't work with Ariadalina, and she happily invited all the girls who weren't supposed to be at the event. Ariadalina confessed that since she was indebted to Dorothy, she asked forgiveness for the modest preparations. The lady politely informed her that everything the Duchess had done was simply superb, and Ariadalina had probably done a good job. Dorothy apologized for calling the girl a Duchess, since she had long been deprived of that title. The girls were watching the villain Ariadalina's behavior closely, but today she looked so calm, but each of them thought that the lady was very worried inside. Indeed, it was quite pleasant to be with Ariadalina at tea, and she also offered the lady to try a wonderful flower tea from the mountains. After a pleasant conversation, Dorothy admitted that she would like to see the magnificent garden of the mansion, about which there were so many rumors. It was cloudy outside, and Ariadalina was worried whether everything would be okay, but Dorothy insisted that she wanted to see the garden during the rain, because when else would he have such a wonderful opportunity? Her friends also confirmed that they would be happy to visit the famous garden, and now it was up to the lady to decide. The guests insisted that Ariadalina show them the beautiful garden, and after thinking a little, the girl agreed. Ariadalina couldn't even imagine what the guest might be planning with this act, so she simply decided to see what would happen next and go to the flower garden. A young maid just happened to look into the room where the tea party was taking place and thought Ariadalina did not ask to remove the cold tea before her arrival. She thought that if she put everything in order, the mistress would surely praise her, and now she needed to quickly and thoroughly clean up. The maid began her work responsibly, but her gaze was drawn to the mysterious gleam that emanated from the ring lying on the floor, and it definitely belonged to one of the aristocrats. It was a beautiful warm day outside, and the girls were slowly strolling through the fragrant garden. All this time they had been communicating quite pleasantly, and Ariadalina could not even imagine where to expect a trick from Dorothy. While cleaning, the maid found a ring with a precious stone on the carpet and thought that perhaps one of the guests had dropped it, so she quickly finished cleaning and decided that the ring needed to be returned to its owner as soon as possible. Walking through the blooming garden, the ladies wondered if the Duke had brought the girl to the palace because he wanted to look after her. They considered the Duke to be an incredibly responsible person, because just think, he was ready to bear the sins of his ex-wife. That's why Ariadalina is proud to live in the main house, and the Duke himself brought her here. She tried to behave politely and with dignity, but all this time something was deeply troubling her soul. Suddenly, Dorothy admitted that judging by the clouds it was going to rain soon, so they should probably go back and continue drinking tea. But Ariadalina, looking at the sky, did not see a single cloud, but still agreed to play the game Dorothy had conceived. Dorothy was the first to enter the living room and immediately sighed that she had probably taken off the ring before going for a walk and left it here. But now it is not in its place, and probably it disappeared or someone brazenly came and stole it. Ariadalina couldn't believe that Dorothy had just finally started her insidious plan, which she had thought out in detail for a long time. The lady said that she would order the servants to search the room, but for some reason Dorothy refused her offer. He stated that judging by the cleaning, a servant had come in here while there was no one in the room. The haughty Dorothy asked for this maid to be brought here urgently, and a frightened Roddy entered the living room. The maid told the whole truth, that when she was cleaning she saw the ring and picked it up from the floor, but Dorothy insisted that she put it on the table. Rhodey always took her job seriously and insisted that the ring was indeed on the floor, so she tried to find the owner. Suddenly, the guest declared that everything indicated that the maid had tried to steal the ring, and if you found something, you should immediately give it to the head maid. Shielding the innocent Rhodey with her body, Ariadalina confidently replied that it was just a mistake and that she was just a child and still studying. But the lady insisted that if they didn't deal with such a mistake properly now, they could become the real masters. Ariadalina is still in the status of a criminal, but even before that, she was never the real mistress of this house. The guest insisted that even if the maid was young, she should still be punished for her mistake so that it would not happen again. Or perhaps the one who failed to train her properly should be punished, taking all the blame on herself. Ariadalina understood that the impudent lady was trying to turn the situation in such a way that she would take full responsibility for what happened. Dorothy smiled and said that out of mercy she was going to give the girl a choice, or she must punish the child herself, or kneel before her and sincerely ask for forgiveness for the fact that this house has dishonored the honor of the Marquise herself. Without a second thought, Ariadalina fell to her knees in front of Dorothy and bowed her head low. Even the lady herself did not expect the situation to be resolved this way, because she was sure that the hostess would now defend her dignity. Dorothy asked what Ariadalina was doing now, and the lady replied that she was sincerely apologizing, as she had asked. Kneeling was humiliating only for nobles, but not for Ariadalina, who had already seen a lot in her life. Ariadalina declared that she was too soft-hearted to beat a child, and besides, she had no intention of playing along with the vile Dorothy. The lady stated that the maid's mistake was entirely her responsibility, so she asked the guest to forgive her and not hold a grudge for the mistake she had made unintentionally. The heroine's voice sounded rather strange, and at that moment the Duke appeared before the guests, together with Dorofe. The lady never expected to see the princess at her tea party, especially at the most inopportune moment. The Duke stated that it was probably worth clarifying the situation that had happened, and his appearance was also quite strange for Ariadalina. And everyone understood that Carlothian would not allow everything to remain as it was until he found out the details of what was happening. But suddenly Ariadalina closed the door right in front of the Duke and Dorofe, and this gesture simply shocked all the ladies present. Ariadalina understood that given the situation, it would be problematic if Dorofe found out about what had happened. After all, the heroine knew that Dorothy was a close friend of Dorofe, and the princess would certainly not like this. Ariadalina said in a sweet voice that it was quite painful to feel hatred from others, and Dorothy probably understood what she was talking about. The Duke and Dorofe could not believe their eyes when Ariadalina personally closed the door right in front of their faces. A few minutes later, Ariadalina finally opened the door and pretended that the Duke had not seen her kneeling right in front of Dorothy and asked her what had brought him here. The Duke assured her that he had seen with his own eyes the girl just kneeling, but Ariadalina played a different game, insisting that she had done nothing. The princess didn't want to figure anything out at all, and Ariadalina had already thought that they would simply turn a blind eye to this situation. Dorofe asked to give her a minute, and she probably really wanted to talk to her close friend. Dorothy's friends also said that they would go for a walk in the garden while their friend talked. Seeing the Duke, Ariadalina felt a pleasant sensation and did not even understand when he managed to enter. Ariadalina sent the maids to calm down little Rhodey quickly, and all this time the Duke stood next to her silently, thereby causing awkward feelings. Finally he called her name, and Ariadalina, smiling sweetly, turned in his direction. Then something happened that she least expected, and the Duke simply took the girl in his arms, holding her tightly around the waist. Ariadalina felt awkward in the arms of the masculine young man who had just taken the shoes off her feet. And looking into his mysterious eyes, she had absolutely no idea what he was going to do with her next. Unexpectedly for herself, Ariadalina screamed loudly, but then asked for forgiveness because she was simply frightened by the unexpected actions of the young man. He asked the girl not to move and pulled back the hem of her dress, exposing Ariadalina's legs. As it turned out, the girl's knees were very swollen and there were large bruises on both legs, and it all happened because she practically fell to the ground. The Duke seemed to have pulled out a jar of healing cream from nowhere and was about to smear it on the girl's bruises. This tender moment left the lady with no chance, and the Duke's care melted her heart in an instant. He even started carrying a jar of healing cream with him on purpose, because someone was constantly getting into trouble and getting bruises and wounds. The Duke gently rubbed the oil on the girl's knees and lowered the hem of her dress while she continued to sit on his lap and look straight into his eyes. At this moment, the secular ladies who arrived with Dorothy were standing on the palace grounds and were talking about how Lady Ariadalina had really changed. They couldn't believe that they had just seen with their own eyes how Ariadalina, for the sake of a servant, knelt before the princess's friend. At this tea party, everyone had gone too far, but now everyone had to sort out their feelings and attitudes towards each other. The ladies were incredibly worried about the friendship between the princess and Dorothy, because their relationship had been strained lately. Dorothy asked if her friend had really pulled off the scam with the ring and if it had all been a setup. Dorothy could understand everything simply by looking at her friend, and today she came to find out how Ariadalina was doing and remembered that Dorothy had also come here. The friend knew that Dorothy had arranged all this only because of the Marquise, because he was someone she sincerely admired. One most terrible day, a stranger, Ariadalina, took away the most precious thing in her life. That is why Dorothy could not forgive her in any way, and was ready to do everything to make the scoundrel suffer. Although Dorothy was a little disappointed in the situation, she still understood her dear friend's feelings perfectly, because it was incredibly hard for her too. And her behavior was not a reason to hate the person with whom she had been friends for many years. Dorothy took her friend by the hands and only asked her to promise that she would never do anything like that again. All this time, Dorothy's friends watched the touching scene from afar and were also worried about their quarrel. But today was that very wonderful day when Dorothy and Dorothea finally made peace, and Lady Ariadalina showed herself in high society. Ariadalina had been sitting on the Duke's lap all this time, and just at that moment all the guests returned. Everyone saw that Ariadalina, sitting on the Duke's lap, was quite close to him, and that they clearly had a closer relationship than was known. Seeing this scene, Dorothy said that she had to leave and refused to accompany Ariadalina. The lady then asked for forgiveness for what had happened then, and both girls understood what was being discussed. It had been too long, and it was probably too late for an apology, but Ariadalina felt she had to say it. She wished Dorothy a good journey and asked her to be careful on her way home. Having changed her mind, Dorothy looked at Ariadalina and thanked her for the pleasant time they had spent together as she left the ducal mansion. After the important tea party, Ariadalina could finally catch her breath and asked the Duke not to do anything that others might misunderstand. She even suggested that the gentleman still liked her, but he was unlikely to marry her. And if he wasn't going to take her as his wife, he shouldn't let anyone sit on his lap. But the Duke insisted that he didn't do that to just anyone. Now rumors may begin to spread that Ariadalina sat on the Duke's lap, and soon the entire empire will know about it. The Duke admitted that he had actually come to give the girl one thing, and that he had a key in his palm. It was the same key to the cellar below, which contained ancient books about the mysterious magical powers that the Duke had reported earlier. The lady decided to look for the necessary books alone, because the Duke had too much to do right now. On her way to the basement, Ariadalina met a maid in front of her, who immediately addressed her. It was Rhodey, who was incredibly worried about the lady, as well as about her knees, on which she had to stand in front of the Marquise. The lady insisted that she was perfectly fine, but her swollen face was visible from afar because the maid had been crying and worrying all this time. It was from the maid that she found out that there was no basement in the main building, and if we were talking about the basement in the outbuilding, it was currently used as a warehouse. And Carlothian didn't even say where exactly this basement was, sending the girl into complete obscurity. I seem to have remembered that there is another slightly strange place in the Duke's mansion that few people know about. The girl stopped near the wall where the painting hung, and Ariadalina couldn't figure out where the basement door could be. Knocking on the wall, the maid noted that this wall sounded different, so she thought that if there was a secret storage room in the mansion, it might be here. The girls promised each other to keep it a secret, and Rhodey hurried back to work so as not to distract her mistress. Ariadalina continued her search for the mysterious door to the basement, knocking on the walls of the corridor. Her attention was drawn to the keyhole, behind which the door was probably hidden, but suddenly she heard a strange sound. And the girls' guesses were not wrong, because the next second the door to the basement creaked open. Ariadalina's interest got the better of her, and she realized that she absolutely had to see what was in this mysterious basement. There were shelves with a huge number of books, and the heroine could not even imagine that there could be so many of them here. She looked with interest at the shelves on which stood numerous books on various rituals and mysterious magic. Ariadalina had no idea where to start looking and moved towards the first shelf that caught her attention, from which she took out a book about the basics of black magic. The essence of black magic is a curse, and since it is magic that contradicts the moral and world order, its use entails serious consequences, so first it was necessary to find a partner. Black magic had the ability to attract each other, so a partner was simply necessary to use the power. When the black magic of two magicians resonates, its effect is amplified many times over, and this is a mutual benefit of the union. After thinking for a moment, Ariadalina realized that this was even similar to their situation with the Duke. But all this was only temporary, and the moment black magic comes together, a huge disaster can happen. For the heroine, this was the worst possible development of events, and there could be no other option with a magical union. Ariadalina spent quite a few hours in the basement with the books, and during this time the girl was incredibly tired, but she didn't even look at a small part. She confessed to the Duke that it was difficult to find the cellar because he left without explaining anything, but the lady still found everything herself. The Duke even allowed her to keep the key and do as her heart desired. The heroine knew that she just needed to quickly find a way for them both to be safe, but her head ached incredibly from the heavy thoughts. She suddenly felt difficulty breathing and realized that the corset of her dress was pressing hard on her chest, and this garment always brought a lot of problems. She turned her back to the young man and asked him to untie his laces so that she could get a breath of fresh air. After her words, there was a long silence, and Ariadalina even asked if the young man had heard her request. The Duke's hand slowly reached towards the girl's back. She understood that they argued and quarreled every day, and was the young man really worried about such a trifle? After all, every time he simply made her even more nervous, experiencing unpleasant sensations and a heavy burden on his heart. She didn't understand why the young man couldn't just unbutton her dress, but he admitted that he had never actually done that before. The Duke felt more and more tenderness towards this girl, and he understood that the embarrassment was leaving, giving way to joy and mutual understanding. At that moment, Ariadalina felt incredibly stupid, asking such frank things of the venerable gentleman. His hands were shaking slightly, and he could feel the warmth of her body filling the space between them. Ariadalina, noticing his confusion, smiled, and this smile seemed to dispel his worries. It was full of trust, and this gave him strength. When the last knot was untied, he met her gaze, and in that moment, time seemed to stand still, their eyes filled with emotions that they both tried to hide. Ariadalina was silently drowning in the charm of the young gentleman, and even in the past she was like that. For several mornings in a row, Ariadalina woke up in the Duke's arms, and today she realized that she had already gotten used to waking up like this. Her throat was getting better and better every day, but for some reason she was sure that this was only temporary happiness. She looked at the sleeping Carlothian and gently stroked his head to wake him up, but instead, the sleeping Duke, without opening his eyes, gently put his arm around the girl's neck and again threw her onto the bed, covering her with a blanket. So she found herself back in bed in his arms, and the sleeping young man didn't even wake up. She asked what the young man was doing when all she wanted was to get up in bed. But in an unexpectedly gentle voice, Carlosian whispered that he would like to stay with her a little longer and meet this beautiful morning, but they both knew that now was not the time for this. But they could not leave each other because they simply enjoyed being together. Ariadalina used to be a cruel villain, but in this life she was a different person, and in the arms of this man she experienced strong feelings. But before they had time to enjoy the beautiful, calm morning, the butler entered the bedroom and shouted loudly that something bad had happened. He reported that an urgent order had come from above and asked if the venerable Duke was okay. Ariadalina was surprised that such an urgent order could be sent so early in the morning, and she was very interested in this news. As it turned out, a messenger from the royal palace had arrived, who had been sent by the emperor himself. But the messenger arrived for the lady, who had to be urgently transferred to the prison of the royal palace. In an instant, the Duke's eyes filled with rage, and he asked again what the butler had just said. It turns out that someone put a curse on Princess Dorothea last night, and Lady Ariadalina is the only suspect. This news stunned the Duke and the girl, and Ariadalina immediately screamed loudly that this was a complete lie and that she was not guilty of anything. She was sure that Carlothian would not believe her words anyway, because the previous Villainess had acted in exactly this way. Ariadalina stood up and confidently declared that only she could resolve this misunderstanding, and was ready to find evidence for everyone that all information about her was a complete lie. She had to do everything possible because she really wasn't guilty of anything. All the events that had caused the girl unpleasant feelings now made her just want to cry from helplessness. But the curse happened again, and exactly at the moment when it was supposed to happen, and Ariadalina suspected that it was most likely the work of the princess. She must have just been irritated by her close contact with the Duke, and the heroine was focused on restoring her voice, and at some point simply lost her vigilance. The imperial guards who came for the criminal reported that the imperial family had ordered the girl's arrest for attempted murder of the crown princess. There were a lot of people standing in the duchy's living room, and Ariadalina was even surprised that they all came just for her alone. And everything turned out to be much more terrible than she could have imagined, because the heroine definitely did not expect such an outcome of events. The Duke came to the girl's defense and asked if they were really going to arrest her just on the basis of an assumption when the situation was still unclear. Carlothian was now behaving with dignity, despite the fact that he assured that he would never trust this girl again. The guards tied Ariadalina's fragile hands with strong ropes and prepared to take the lady to the dungeon for criminals. The rope pulled the girl's hands hard, and the person who was pulling her forward didn't think at all about whether she was in pain or not. As soon as he began to lead the girl out of the duchy, the Duke ran up to her and grabbed the lady by the waist so that the guard could not move her. Ariadalina felt the warm touch of his hands, and even in this terrible moment, she felt his support. He asked the guards to be more polite, but they insisted that this woman was a criminal who had twice attempted on the life of the crown princess. But the Duke did not want to hear anything, because he said that it was not yet clear who exactly the criminal was. The guard assured that the Duke should understand the situation better than anyone, but for some reason he is now saying rather strange things. Ariadalina humbly lowered her hands and asked the young men to stop arguing, because this was probably her fate. Tears appeared in her blue eyes, and she sincerely thanked the Duke for the respect and care he had given her. Turning his back to the girl, the Duke understood that now every minute counted. She needed to come up with something so that the lady would not be sent to prison. But unfortunately, now he could do nothing, and the girls with their hands tied were already being taken in a carriage, asking the first questions. She insisted that she had not cast the curse, but the guard had met Ariadalina more than once and knew how skillfully she could lie. It was obvious that no one would believe the Villainess, and Ariadalina asked how the princess was feeling. She learned that the curse was blocked by holy power, and that was the saddest news. Now, Ariadalina was trying to find out the details of what had happened, but the young man laughed, because the criminal herself should have known more than anyone else, and now she was asking stupid questions. Ignoring the young man's smirks, the heroine managed to find out that the curse began to manifest itself at midnight. And it is at this time that the heroine begins to have an attack, but it is probably not worth talking about now. She assumed that Karloshin was hiding something and pretending not to know anything, remaining in the shadows, and he probably didn't intend to tell her anything like that. A sharp pain pierced Ariadalina's soul because she had once again hoped for something, and now she had to figure everything out herself. A few hours later, the carriage arrived at the Imperial Palace, where the criminal was ordered to be delivered. The girl was already expected in the courtroom, where they wanted to find out whether she was guilty of the crime. She was brought to a huge hall to meet with the emperor himself and his family to clarify the truth of the curse. An emperor named Alexei Borovichia admitted that his knight had done a good job in such a short time and would certainly be rewarded for it. The emperor was perplexed as to how sweet Ariadalina could commit another grave crime, already being a criminal. Sitting next to the emperor was a lady with pink hair, and it was Princess Elmondi, the real villain from the original story. Kneeling before the imperial family and holding the rope that bound her hands, Ariadalina again confidently declared that she had done nothing. But the empress shouted menacingly that no one had given the girl the right to speak, but the heroine was sure that the suspect could at least say something in his own defense. Moreover, Dorothée probably believed Ariadalina and not her husband, but for some reason in this situation she could not say anything. To finally prove her innocence to everyone, Ariadalina proudly raised her head and admitted that at that time she was absolutely in no condition to cast a strong magical curse. Dorothée believed that Ariadalina had nothing to do with this, but those present were still interested in the details of what happened. Now the girl had to provide evidence, since she so confidently confirmed her impunity. Ariadalina wondered if she could talk about her mental illness, but she was afraid that if she mentioned it, she would immediately be considered a black witch. They can use this as evidence that she is using black magic, and while the lady remained silent, everyone thought that she had nothing more to say. Dorothée asked the young man to stop asking a one-sided question, because he kept asking whether Ariadalina was guilty of the crime. But he kept saying, "This woman tried to kill the princess twice, so they can't let this continue." After listening to the arguments of those present, Princess Elmondi expressed her opinion and suggested doing something different. In the Empire, admitting to using black magic is punishable by death, but the lady genuinely cared for the last princess and was also a friend of Ariadalina. Therefore, she suggested placing her in a special cell and then calmly listening to the girl's opinion. But the heroine understood that this was simply a reprieve, and if they wanted to give her the death penalty, then let them do it now. And perhaps this time it would be better to be reborn again. Before, Ariadalina did not know whether the Duke would remember her, but now she had no other choice. In order to receive the death penalty, she decided to admit her guilt and simply quietly leave this world, as she had long intended. But the self-confident lady hardly thought about anyone else except her desire to die and not be reborn, and she completely forgot that there was another person in her life for whom it was worth trying to do everything possible to stay alive. The Duke suddenly burst into the courtroom and headed straight towards the Emperor and his wife, who sat on the throne in bewilderment. The Duke dropped to one knee and asked for forgiveness for such a sudden intrusion, but had to provide information about his ex-wife. Everyone assumed that since the girl was in the Duke's mansion, he could probably notice something strange in her behavior. Seeing the sweet Duke in front of her, Ariadalina held her breath and waited to see what he was going to do next. And is this young man really going to tell her right now about the dark magic she used last time she was a villain? Looking into the eyes of the Emperor, with his head held high, the Duke admitted that the criminal had done nothing while the curse was being cast. The young man who most of all wanted to punish Ariadalina jumped up from his seat indignantly. The Empress asked if the Duke could prove his words, and in response to this, unexpectedly for everyone, he answered in the affirmative. The Emperor asked the Duke himself if he really knew that the girl had done nothing, but now he was interested in where Carlotian got such information. The heroine knew that to prove this, she had to mention the crazy disease, but it was his huge secret. She was sure that Carloshan would not do this, but the young man stated that at that very moment the criminal was with him. The princess asked if the Duke really wanted to say that he had been with this woman all this time, and could they really have been together at such a late hour, since the curse was cast around midnight. The Duke continued to confirm her words that exactly at midnight he was with his ex-wife, and was that really a problem? Someone present loudly called the girl unworthy of forgiveness, declaring that all the rumors about her were completely true. Playing along with the Duke, Ariadalena stated that she did not want to create problems for the young master, so she did not admit it earlier. But since these two had once been married, it was understandable, because the couple was surely destined to be together again. Ariadalena didn't want everyone to perceive the situation this way, but now she had absolutely no right to. The Duke suggested that while people were checking his mansion, Ariadalena should be taken into custody and asked that everything be completed as quickly as possible. Approaching the girl, the Duke extended his hand to her and asked if she really planned to sit tied up like that any longer. She couldn't believe that Carlosian had just saved her in front of the imperial family, and the first thing she did was thank the young man for such an act. Ariadalena tried to stand up, but from kneeling for so long her legs gave way and she accidentally grabbed the Duke's shirt. She couldn't stay on her feet and fell to the floor, but at that moment all the buttons on the young gentleman's shirt came undone, and everyone saw his naked torso. The marks she left on the young man were seen by everyone present, and at that moment Ariadalena was ready to burn with shame. But this situation once again proved that Ariadalena and the Duke were definitely together that night. She didn't want to be a laughingstock anymore and asked to be taken to jail immediately, and it sounded like she was going for a walk. The Emperor's son stated that given the Duke's relationship with the criminal, he could be suspected of deliberate patronage. Therefore, until the search of the mansion is completed, Carlothian must also remain in the palace. At this time in prison, the young man introduced a fragile lady in a pink dress who was still trying to find out information about the curse placed on the princess. It was the same curse as the first time, and it was suspicious if the same person was using the same method. Finally, they reached the dungeon where Ariadalena was destined to remain. For some time, the young man asked them to remain silent until her alibi was confirmed. Ariadalena found herself in a dungeon, the walls of which were cold and damp, and the silence around seemed oppressive, and every sound, even the rustle of her dress, echoed in the emptiness. She couldn't believe that she was here, far from light and freedom, and her thoughts kept returning to Duke Carlosian. Lately, the girl had become accustomed to sleeping in warmth, and in this dungeon she felt incredibly lonely. As expected, it was not worth asking to live in the same room, so as not to experience such mental anguish from separation. From strong emotions, the girl put her head on her knees and dozed off, and when she woke up, she couldn't even understand how much time had passed. Looking at the bars, she saw a princess who wanted to talk to her. She asked if the girl had really slept with Duke Carlosian, and Ariadalena did not expect to see such a frank question. The lady grabbed the bars and shouted loudly once again, asking if their relationship had really become so close. Ariadalena confessed that they really did spend that night together, and no one should know further details. The princess asked if the prisoner really thought that this would change anything, since she had simply spent the night in bed with him. But Ariadalena just smiled and replied that people's opinions can change, and everyone has the right to do so. The princess's gaze was incredibly cruel, and the heroine felt a terrible hatred for Ariadalena, and the princess clearly wanted her to die when she was still locked in the monastery. Even for the villainous Ariadalena, this sounded too cruel, but she had liked the princess before. Ariadalena admitted that the princess once helped her when she ended up in BTS, and there was nowhere to expect help from. This information was in Ariadalena's memories, and the princess was the only one who had ever treated her well. The girl admitted that she really trusted the princess, and she asked to say it again. Without hiding her feelings, Ariadalena repeated once again that she had trusted the person who was next to her all her life. But for some reason, in response to these words, the princess laughed maliciously and behaved very strangely. Covering her mouth with her hand, she declared that these words sounded simply disgusting, and it was a shame that Ariadalena had even said them. Of all people, the princess had a special attitude towards Ariadalena, and she probably always wished her harm. Suddenly the girl turned around, and Ariadalena realized that she had heard the sound of the door opening and had probably sneaked in here. At that moment, the guard who had transferred her here entered the dungeon and called her by name. They confirmed that the testimonies of the mansion's employees and the Duke coincided, and carried out all the necessary investigations. Therefore, Ariadalena can leave the dungeon right now because her work will soon be completed. Ariadalena believed that everything would work out for the best, and with special joy she stepped over the bars of the dungeon. She wasn't going to tell anyone that the princess had come to talk to her, because that would probably get her into big trouble. The imperial family still had doubts about Ariadne's innocence, and who would have thought, because in the past she was a cruel villain. She believed that Carloshan would not leave her in trouble and would do everything possible to bring her back to a life full of light and hope, and now right in front of her stood the young man who saved her from imprisonment. The wounds from the rope still remained on the girl's tender wrists, and the Duke declared that despite the lack of serious evidence, they dared to treat her like that. The guard claimed he was acting according to the situation, and Ariadne felt the atmosphere between them growing tense. Carlottian asked if the young man could take responsibility for his loose tongue, but the heroine placed her palm on the Duke's face, trying to switch his attention to herself. She smiled and asked me to simply return to the duchy because she was very cold to me, and she didn't want any sort of showdown at all. The Duke was only too glad to return with the lovely lady back to the mansion, so he deftly picked her up in his arms and finally took her with him. Ariadne cried out that she could walk herself, but the young man smiled and joked that she was very slow, and that this way they would get to the carriage faster. It's funny, but Ariadne was still worried about the Duke's remarriage, because there would certainly be a scandal with his ex-wife. Whatever the rumors, there are many people who want to marry the Duke because, after all, he is quite a famous and respectable man. And now, considering that the girl no longer had status, she would not be able to become the mistress of his house. But now she didn't care, because this was the minimum retribution for all the sins. That evening, the princess could not find peace, and her head was filled with terrible, frightening thoughts. She didn't understand why everything happened this way, and Ariadne again remained unpunished. She felt how she hated this girl, who was always getting in her way and was already getting on her nerves. The lady spent the entire evening thinking about how to punish the culprit and finally make her bow down before everyone, asking for forgiveness for the atrocities she had committed. The maid said that in the palace everyone was whispering about Ariadne and the Duke, and these gossips were never going to keep quiet. There were now rumors of her engagement to the Duke, and now the princess did not know what to do with the lies she had previously spread. After all, if gossip about the Duke and his ex-wife spread, she would become a laughingstock in front of all high society, so she definitely couldn't just leave things as they were. To finally put an end to this situation, the princess decided to meet with the Duke and ask the maid to send an invitation to the palace, and also to invite his lovely lady love. She also asked to find an obedient maid who would be ready to carry out any of her orders. She grabbed the maid by the face and, looking into her frightened eyes, declared that she would have to carry out one important task. Several days have passed since Ariadne returned to the mansion, but the palace still has not identified the culprit. She knew the princess was to blame for everything, but there was no evidence that she was going to find. In the palace she felt quite free, and even allowed herself to fly into the Duke's office without knocking. But now there was a really important matter, and Ariadne wanted to say something very important to her heart. She admitted that this conversation should take place in private, so it would be better for them to leave the office for a while and go to a more secluded place. To Ariadne's surprise, the Duke readily agreed, and informed the men sitting in the office that he had to step away for a moment. They came to the Duke's bedroom, and he asked the reason why the lady had pulled him out of the meeting, and as it turned out, she wanted to talk about dark magic. Ariadne came to the conclusion that the more often she contacted the Duke, the better her condition became. She thought it was just a temporary solution, but now she was not at all sure of her previous opinion. Duke Carloshan gently placed Lady Ariadne on his lap. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. He felt her warmth filling him, and the excitement of closeness filled his heart. Apparently, the Duke was not against helping the girl, and even came to her during the trial, and now he was much kinder than before. She looked at him with sincere eyes and said that they definitely had to come up with some way, because he wasn't going to sleep with her every day. But for some reason, the Duke remained silent in response to the question asked, and it seemed that he had already known the answer to it for a long time. Ariadne had absolutely no ideas, but the Duke began to mumble something about a sacred relic. The sacred relic possessed great divine power, and the Duke heard that it was hidden in a small village where the very land was overflowing with divine energy. The Duke admitted that he felt that thanks to this power, his madness was weakening, and his mind was becoming purer and clearer. And this meant that if Ariadne could get the sacred relic, then the Duke would have a chance for a happy and peaceful life. There were rumors that there was a high probability that madness would eventually stop manifesting itself, but no one had ever managed to find such a relic, and it was simply impossible. But Arya Delina believed that somewhere there must be an accessible method that could finally cure mental illness, so that they could forget about painful torment forever and live a happy life.